Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. The Census of the Steppe, counting the people of early Mongolia. Imagine you are standing on the vast, rolling plains of Mongolia, sometime in the early 13th century. The wind is gentle yet persistent, and the horizon stretches endlessly, dotted only by the occasional yurt or herd of grazing animals. In this boundless expanse, a single, seemingly mundane task is taking place that would define the Mongol Empire's ability to organize, govern, and eventually conquer much of Eurasia: counting its people. The census, or population survey, was no simple headcount. For the Mongols, it was an intricate web of observation, reporting, and documentation, a bureaucratic skeleton hidden beneath the image of wild horsemen and unstoppable armies. The task was handled by officials appointed by the Khan, who were responsible not only for tallying humans, but also for assessing wealth, livestock, and resources. This was essential in a society where survival depended on mobility, livestock, and the ability to quickly mobilize for war. Why a census was critical. At first glance, counting people might seem mundane, almost dull. But consider the alternative. The Khan needed to know how many warriors he could summon, how much tribute could be collected from each tribe, and how resources could be distributed across thousands of kilometers of territory. The Mongol Empire was not built solely on military prowess. It was an empire built on precise logistics and administration. The census served as the foundational tool to manage both. Officials tasked with this job traveled from clan to clan, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometers on horseback. They recorded the names of heads of households, their families, and the number of yurts each family occupied. Beyond counting humans, they cataloged livestock: horses, sheep, cattle, camels, and goats, because wealth in the steppe was measured primarily in animals. A household with 50 sheep and 2 horses was fundamentally different from one with 200 sheep and 10 horses. And the Khan needed this information to make decisions about taxation, conscription, and land distribution. The process itself was painstaking. Clerks, often literate in the Uyghur script adapted for Mongolian, would write down names, numbers, and observations on long rolls of paper or bark. The records were then compiled into larger reports, sometimes passed upward through multiple layers of administration before reaching the Khan himself. For the ordinary herder, this must have seemed both intrusive and strange. Strangers arriving to ask about the contents of your herd, the names of your children, and the amount of fodder you had stored. Daily life during a census. Imagine a Mongol household during a census inspection. Early in the morning, the family would awaken to find a delegation of officials approaching. They would likely set up a small tent or stall to conduct interviews, while the head of the family carefully enumerated livestock. Children might be pulled aside for counting, while women explained storage and household arrangements. This was not a brief visit. It could take hours or even days, depending on the size of the community. For the officials themselves, the work was far from glamorous. They had to travel long distances, often in harsh weather, keeping track of countless numbers. Mistakes were costly. Underreporting could lead to penalties for the local clan, while overreporting could create logistical challenges for the empire. Officials were trained to ask carefully phrased questions and to notice discrepancies. Their notebooks would be filled with tally marks, sketches of yurts, and notes about each clan's resources. The census also served another purpose beyond numbers. It was a way for the Khan to assert presence and authority. A census official visiting a remote tribe reminded the people that even in the endless steppe, the central power of the Khan could reach them. It was an early form of governance, combining documentation with surveillance, ensuring that no part of the empire was entirely autonomous. Challenges and adaptations. Conducting a census in Mongolia posed unique challenges. The nomadic lifestyle meant that families and herds were constantly on the move. Officials often had to coordinate their visits with seasonal migrations, ensuring that they could find households when they were in a particular region. Records had to account for temporary absences, such as families away on trade or during military campaigns. Furthermore, the vast distances and harsh climate tested both the endurance and accuracy of the census process. Officials relied heavily on local guides, interpreters, and tribal leaders to navigate the terrain and gather information. Even then, the census was never perfect. Estimates and adjustments were inevitable. Yet, even imperfect counts were invaluable. They provided a foundation for the empire's organization, taxation, and military planning, allowing a Khan like Genghis to mobilize tens of thousands of troops with precision. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the census was its reflection of human resilience and adaptation. Families adjusted to the presence of bureaucrats, sometimes inflating or deflating their reported livestock, while officials developed clever methods to verify information. This interaction between state and society, though mundane and seemingly dull, reveals a sophisticated understanding of administration in a context often imagined as purely wild or lawless. As the first section of this story draws to a close, consider the lingering question: how did a society so vast, mobile, and seemingly ungovernable manage to create detailed records that inform taxation, military campaigns, and governance? The answer lies in a combination of human ingenuity, rigorous procedure, and the unglamorous but indispensable work of those who kept track of numbers, names, and herds across the endless steppe. And yet one might wonder, even with such diligence, how often did these records truly reflect reality? Could a census official in 1200s Mongolia ever truly know the state of a moving, living, breathing empire? When you think about the Mongol Empire, what likely comes to mind first is cavalry charging across the steppe, banners flapping, and cities falling. But beneath these dramatic images lay an invisible engine of governance, the meticulous record-keeping and census-taking that allowed the Khans to understand, manage, and ultimately control a vast population. In Section 1, we explored the basic process of counting people and livestock. Now let's go deeper into the methods, challenges, and unexpected consequences of this bureaucratic feat. The organization behind the count. The Mongols divided their empire into units, each responsible for both military and administrative functions. The census mirrored this hierarchy. At the lowest level, tribal leaders and local officials conducted initial counts within their communities. Their records were then sent upward through a chain of increasingly centralized officials. This structure ensured that even the most remote families were accounted for, or at least recorded as accurately as possible. Officials maintained detailed lists not just of numbers but also of relationships. Families were broken down into households, which were then grouped into clans, and clans into larger tribal confederations. The resulting data provided a multi-layered map of the population, allowing the Khan to track who owed what in tribute, who could be conscripted for military service, and who had resources that could be mobilized in times of crisis. Each layer of reporting introduced its own complications. Tribal leaders sometimes had incentives to underreport wealth or overreport loyalty. Likewise, officials might exaggerate the completeness of their work to curry favor with superiors. These distortions, however, were often caught in cross-referencing officials compared reports across clans and regions, creating a system that, while imperfect, was remarkably robust for its time. The role of literacy and record-keeping. The Mongol Empire was famously reliant on oral tradition, but when it came to governance, written records were essential. The Uyghur script, adapted for Mongolian, became the backbone of bureaucratic documentation. Clerks trained in this script meticulously recorded information on rolls of paper, bark, or parchment, carefully noting names, ages, household sizes, and livestock counts. For the ordinary nomad, the presence of written records may have seemed alien. Unlike the steppe's oral histories and songs, These written documents were impersonal and detached, capturing only the bare facts necessary for administration. Yet this impersonal approach was deliberate. By reducing individuals to numbers and categories, the Khan could wield authority across thousands of kilometers without needing to personally know each subject, a practical necessity in a sprawling empire. The work of these clerks, though tedious, had lasting consequences. Without their careful documentation, the Khan could not have planned military campaigns with such precision, allocated resources efficiently, or collected taxes reliably. Their efforts highlight a curious truth. Empires are rarely built on heroic battles alone. They often rely on the invisible, monotonous labor of those who keep track of the everyday. Unexpected insights from the census. The census did more than just count people. It revealed patterns of settlement, migration, and economic activity. Officials noticed which areas had larger concentrations of livestock, which clans tended to move seasonally versus those that were more stationary, and even which communities were more likely to comply with orders from central authority. This information allowed the Khan not only to extract resources efficiently, but also to anticipate potential unrest. Interestingly, some census data highlighted subtle social dynamics. For example, households with large numbers of children might indicate higher fertility rates, but also increased demands on food and pastures. Officials could then advise on grazing rotations or resource distribution, indirectly shaping local survival strategies. Even the smallest details, such as noting the number of camels for transport, had strategic significance, influencing how goods and messages traveled across the empire. This demonstrates an often overlooked aspect of boring history. Mundane administrative acts frequently had profound consequences. Without these seemingly dull observations, the Mongol army could have faltered due to supply shortages, local rebellions might have gone unnoticed, and the empire might have struggled to maintain cohesion over such vast distances. Human stories amid the numbers. Despite the cold efficiency of the census, human lives were deeply entwined in its processes. Imagine a family of herders being counted for the first time. The children may have been curious or frightened, the elders wary of outsiders, and the women busy recounting household inventories. Some families might have tried to manipulate the data, reporting fewer animals to avoid taxes or more to gain favor. For the officials, this was both a logistical and psychological challenge. They had to navigate tribal politics, cultural norms, and the natural wariness of the nomads. In doing so, they developed negotiation skills, observation techniques, and a careful attention to detail qualities that made the Mongol administration unusually sophisticated for its era. Even the most routine entries could tell stories. A household with only one elderly herder and a few animals reflected vulnerability. A family with a large herd and many children indicated both prosperity and potential military strength. In this way, each line in the census was more than a statistic, it was a microcosm of life on the steppe. The limits of bureaucracy. Yet for all its meticulousness, the census could never capture the full reality of life in Mongolia. Herds wandered, families moved, and some communities deliberately evaded record-keeping. Seasonal migrations meant that counts were often approximate, and despite rigorous procedures, errors inevitably crept in. This raises an intriguing question. How much can bureaucracy truly reflect the complexity of human life, especially in a society as fluid and mobile as the Mongols? The census was both an instrument of control and a tool of understanding, but it was inherently incomplete. It codified what could be observed, yet it could never fully account for the dynamism, unpredictability, and ingenuity of human survival. The census also reminds us that even in a society famed for conquest, administration mattered just as much as combat. The Khan's ability to mobilize tens of thousands of men, to direct resources, and to maintain stability across a vast territory depended on these unglamorous bureaucratic practices. Without them, the empire's legendary efficiency might have dissolved into chaos. As Section 2 closes, the question lingers. If the census was so crucial, how did these records evolve as the empire expanded further into China, Persia, and Europe? Did the Mongols adapt their bureaucratic methods for different cultures and geographies, or did the steppe-style administration remain largely unchanged, even thousands of kilometers from home? By the time the Mongol Empire reached its peak under Genghis Khan and his successors, the census had become more than a mere counting exercise. It was a cornerstone of imperial governance. What began as a practical tool for managing households and livestock evolved into a sophisticated administrative system capable of supporting the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. In this section, we'll explore how these early efforts matured, the challenges they faced as the empire expanded, and the lessons they left for future generations. Expansion and adaptation of census practices. As the Mongols pushed beyond the steppe into regions like northern China, Central Asia, and the Middle East, the nature of their bureaucracy had to change. Unlike the mobile herders of Mongolia, cities and agricultural regions presented different administrative challenges: fixed populations, complex social hierarchies, and more intricate economies. The census evolved to accommodate these new realities. Urban populations were counted not only by household, but also by occupational category: artisans, merchants, tax collectors, and soldiers. Records now included details of property, trade goods, and taxes owed. These adaptations allowed the Mongols to apply the same principles of control and logistics that had worked on the steppe, but in entirely different environments. However, the transition was not seamless. Local officials often resisted Mongol directives or interpreted them through the lens of existing customs. Census takers had to learn new languages, negotiate local power structures, and adapt their recording methods to unfamiliar contexts. Despite these challenges, the system remained impressively effective. By linking the steppe-style mobility with urban administration, the Mongols maintained a coherent empire across thousands of kilometers. The human dimension of bureaucracy. Even at its most advanced, the census remained a deeply human process. It required observation, trust, and sometimes coercion. Officials needed to build relationships with local leaders to ensure accurate reporting, while ordinary people adapted to the presence of bureaucrats in their daily lives. Stories abound of clever strategies employed by both sides. Families might temporarily redistribute animals to appear wealthier or poorer depending on incentives. Officials developed methods to cross-check reports, noting discrepancies between livestock counts and grazing capacity, or comparing multiple reports of the same household. In this way, the census became a dialogue between empire and populace, a negotiation over resources, loyalty, and survival. This human element reminds us that bureaucracy is not merely paperwork, it is the interface between abstract authority and real lives. The Mongol census worked because it accounted for both numbers and behaviors, blending meticulous record-keeping with an understanding of social dynamics. Even in its most boring details, counting animals, listing yurts, noting family sizes, there was insight into how people lived, adapted, and endured. Long-term consequences and lessons learned. The impact of the census extended far beyond administrative efficiency. It shaped military campaigns by providing accurate estimates of available troops and resources. It facilitated taxation and tribute collection, enabling the empire to sustain itself without overburdening any single region. And it created a framework for future governance, influencing the administrative systems of successor states long after the Mongol Empire fragmented. Consider the example of taxation. Because officials knew the size of each household and its livestock, they could impose levies proportionate to means, minimizing rebellion and maximizing compliance. Similarly, by tracking population distribution, the empire could predict migration patterns, monitor potential unrest, and respond to environmental challenges such as drought or overgrazing. In short, a seemingly mundane activity, counting people and animals, was in fact a key to survival and stability. The census also offers a subtle reflection on the nature of power. While the Mongol armies conquered through speed and strategy, their ability to govern relied on patience, attention to detail, and organization. It was an empire built as much on pens and scrolls as on arrows and horses. For us, centuries later, this offers a paradoxical insight. The boring work of administration can create lasting structures that outlive dramatic battles and legendary generals. A reflection on historical significance. As you imagine the endless steppe, with officials riding from yurt to yurt, tallying families and livestock, it is easy to dismiss this as dull. Yet, in these quiet, repetitive acts, the Mongols found control, stability, and insight. The census allowed them to build an empire that could endure logistical challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser powers. Even today, there are echoes of this system in modern governance. The principle is the same. Understanding a population, its resources, and its behavior enables effective administration. While technology has replaced horseback couriers and bark scrolls, the underlying idea that knowing the ordinary details of life is essential for managing society remains unchanged. And so, as the first story concludes, we are left with a thought-provoking question. If empires rise and fall, is it the dramatic battles that determine their fate, or the patient, monotonous work of understanding, counting, and organizing that leaves the deepest mark on history? The steppe may be quiet now, but in the 13th century, every tally, every yurt counted, every sheep noted, contributed to a legacy that shaped the course of Eurasia. Story 2. Keshig, the emperor's personal guard and their daily duties. Imagine standing in the shadow of the imperial tent on the Mongol steppe, somewhere during the reign of Genghis Khan. Around you, the endless grasslands stretch as far as the eye can see, dotted with yurts and grazing animals. But here in this small circle of authority, life follows a different rhythm. It is the world of the Keshig, the Khan's personal guard, an elite cadre of warriors tasked not with conquest alone, but with protection, ceremonial duties, and the subtle art of ensuring that life in the empire's center runs smoothly. At first glance, the Keshig may seem like the most glamorous part of the Mongol administration. Elite riders, impeccably armed, always alert, guarding the Khan's person. But a closer look reveals a daily life defined by meticulous routines, long hours of preparation, and surprisingly mundane responsibilities that were crucial to the stability of the empire. This story is not about battles, though those certainly happened, but about the intricate, often overlooked bureaucracy of personal security. Origins and organization of the Keshig. The Keshig were formally established by Genghis Khan to serve as his permanent bodyguard. Unlike the temporary levies of ordinary warriors called up for campaigns, the Keshig were a standing force, loyal directly to the Khan. They were divided into day guards and night guards, reflecting their continuous duty to protect the emperor around the clock. Membership in the Keshig was highly selective. Men were chosen not only for their skill with horse and weapon, but also for reliability, loyalty, and social connections. Many came from families who had long served the Mongol leadership. Once inducted, a member of the Keshig underwent rigorous training not only in martial skills, but also in observation, discipline, and the careful routines that would govern daily life around the Khan. Their hierarchy was precise. A commander oversaw each shift, reporting up through a chain of officials directly accountable to the Khan. Every role was documented: who led the guard at dawn, who accompanied the Khan during meals, who managed the logistics of horses and equipment. Even seemingly minor details such as which tents were pitched near the Khans and how supplies were stored were governed by written or orally memorized instructions. Daily life and duties. The daily life of the Keshig may seem repetitive, but it was essential. Guards woke before sunrise, ensuring that horses were fed and ready, Weapons were cleaned and maintained, and the perimeter of the imperial camp was secure. During the day, they accompanied the Khan on hunts, inspections, and ceremonial duties. Every action was coordinated, and failure to follow the routine could have serious consequences not just for the individual, but for the security of the entire leadership. The night guard had its own rhythm. Camps were patrolled at intervals, tents were monitored, and signals were established to communicate warnings. The keshig had to remain alert despite fatigue, weather, and long stretches of monotony. For outsiders, this may seem boring, but this disciplined vigilance ensured that the Khan could focus on decision-making, diplomacy, and strategy without concern for personal safety. Interestingly, the keshig also had administrative responsibilities. They managed the Khan's personal stores, recorded arrivals and departures of visitors, and even maintained guest lists for audiences. Their role blurred the line between security and bureaucracy. A guard was also a clerk, a monitor, and sometimes a messenger. In essence, the keshig were the living, moving nodes of imperial organization. Ceremony, loyalty, and subtle power. Beyond their practical duties, the keshig played a symbolic role. Their presence signaled authority, continuity, and order. A Khan surrounded by a disciplined, loyal guard projected stability essential in a society where leadership was contested and succession could be precarious. The daily routines, while mundane, reinforced loyalty and cohesion. Guards who performed their duties flawlessly earned the Khan's trust. Those who faltered risked not only personal shame but also exclusion from the inner circle. Life in the keshig demanded patience and attention to detail. Guards memorized the schedules of officials, anticipated the Khan's needs, and observed subtle shifts in the camp's atmosphere. They learned to recognize potential threats not just from outsiders, but from internal friction among the empire's elite. This required a combination of discipline, intelligence, and a near-constant vigilance that few could sustain for long periods. The keshig also participated in ceremonial events that may seem mundane to us, overseeing meals, arranging tents, escorting diplomats, or coordinating the precise movements of the Khan's entourage. Each task, while repetitive, reinforced the authority of the emperor and the operational stability of the camp. In essence, the daily life of the keshig was a study in controlled monotony, boring in routine, but vital in consequence. A reflection on the hidden work of empire. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of what these guards were maintaining. Across the Mongol steppe, an empire stretched thousands of kilometers, connecting clans, cities, and regions that had never before been united. The keshig formed a small, elite nexus at the center of this vast network. Their repetitive, careful work, the feeding of horses, the inspection of weapons, the careful escorting of visitors was as crucial to the survival of the empire as cavalry charges and sieges. The story of the keshig reminds us that the foundation of power is not always dramatic. Often, it is the small, invisible, and boring tasks, routine, precise, and monotonous, that sustain even the mightiest rulers. Without such structure, chaos could have overtaken the empire from within, regardless of battlefield victories. As Section 1 closes, one question remains. How did the keshig balance their ceremonial and martial duties when the empire went to war? Did their routines adapt to the chaos of campaigns, or did the discipline and order of the camp persist even amidst conquest? When the Mongol Empire expanded beyond the steppe, the keshig were no longer just ceremonial guards. They became integral to both military campaigns and the administration of conquered territories. Their daily routines, honed during peaceful periods, were tested under fire, in unfamiliar lands, and in the complex dynamics of governance. Understanding their role during these times offers a glimpse into how the Mongols combined discipline, bureaucracy, and martial skill into a system that kept an empire stable while it conquered much of Eurasia. The keshig on campaign. During military campaigns, the keshig were assigned multiple roles. At the most basic level, they continued their protective duties, ensuring the safety of the Khan. This was no small task. Genghis Khan and his successors led campaigns personally, often riding to the front lines. The Khan's safety required vigilance not only against enemy combatants but also against treachery from within his own ranks. Campaigns also required logistical coordination. The Keshig ensured that horses were rotated and fed, scouts, reports reached the Khan accurately, and supply lines remained organized. They sometimes acted as messengers, relaying orders across divisions or between the Khan and subordinate commanders. In essence, the Keshig became a living, mobile administration embedded within the army itself. Interestingly, their presence influenced the behavior of the entire force. Soldiers and commanders knew that the Keshig observed everything. Discipline was enforced not only by direct orders, but also by the watchful eyes of these elite guards. Even minor lapses in procedure could be reported, creating a subtle but effective chain of accountability. In this way, the Keshig's boring, repetitive vigilance translated into strategic advantage on the battlefield. Adaptation to foreign environments. As the Mongols moved into urbanized and agricultural regions, the Keshig had to adapt their routines. In cities like Samarkand or Bishbalak, they were responsible for overseeing the security of administrative offices, palaces, and treasuries. Guards had to understand local customs, navigate bureaucratic hierarchies, and enforce the Khan's authority in unfamiliar contexts. This required a blend of cultural sensitivity and disciplined observation. A Keshig officer might monitor local administrators, ensure tax collection was reported accurately, and oversee the quartering of troops, all while maintaining a strict watch over potential threats to the Khan. Their work exemplified the Mongol approach to governance: systematic, precise, and adaptable. Even mundane tasks, inspecting grain stores, checking that garrison assignments were followed, or recording the movements of local officials, had significant consequences. Each report fed into the empire's administrative network, ensuring that control over newly conquered territories remained firm. What may seem boring, checking barrels, counting supplies, and observing bureaucrats, was in fact the scaffolding of imperial power. The Keshig as a political tool. The Keshig were also instrumental in politics. Their loyalty was carefully cultivated, and they often acted as intermediaries between the Khan and local leaders. By assigning trusted guards to oversee sensitive regions or accompany envoys, the Khan could exert influence far beyond the steppe. At times, the Keshig enforced subtle pressure rather than direct force. A well-placed guard could observe a rebellious subordinate, report discrepancies in tax records, or monitor disputes within a clan. In this sense, they functioned as the empire's eyes and ears, boring in their methods perhaps, but highly effective in maintaining cohesion and authority. The ceremonial aspects of their role also reinforced political hierarchy. Guards participating in audiences, rituals, or diplomatic events signaled that the Khan's presence extended everywhere, even when he was physically absent. The empire's power, therefore, relied not only on military might but also on the disciplined, almost invisible presence of these elite attendants. The human experience of the Keshig. Despite their elite status, life in the Keshig was not without hardship. Long campaigns tested endurance, while bureaucratic duties demanded attention to repetitive, meticulous details. Members faced strict discipline, extended separations from families, and the constant pressure of surveillance both of themselves and by others. Yet there was prestige and opportunity. Successful service could lead to advancement, rewards, and positions of influence. The Keshig formed a social network within the empire, linking families and clans across regions. Their mundane routines, feeding horses, inspecting tents, monitoring accounts, became avenues for social mobility and political engagement, showing how even boring work could shape lives and legacies. The broader impact on governance. The Keshig's combination of martial and bureaucratic skill highlights a key insight. Governance is often maintained through repetitive, disciplined work rather than dramatic acts. By observing, recording, and enforcing rules daily, the Keshig helped the Mongol Empire survive the chaos of war, migration, and expansion. Their methods also influenced successor states. After the empire fragmented, the concept of a standing, elite guard with administrative and protective duties spread to neighboring regions. Later empires borrowed the model, blending security with bureaucratic oversight, an idea born on the Mongol steppe, in the boring routines of horse care, record-keeping, and watchful observation. Lingering questions. As Section 2 closes, one question remains. How did the Keshig reconcile their dual identities as elite warriors and meticulous administrators? Did the rigors of daily routine ever conflict with battlefield instincts, or did their discipline enhance both roles? And perhaps more intriguingly, how did ordinary Mongols perceive these elite guards who monitored their rulers so closely, yet whose work remained largely invisible to the wider population? By the time Genghis Khan's empire spanned from the steppes of Mongolia to the edges of China and the Caspian Sea, the Keshig were far more than a personal bodyguard. They had become a critical institution, blending military discipline, administrative skill, and ceremonial authority into a system that reinforced the Khan's power in every corner of the empire. While their daily routines might appear monotonous, feeding horses, inspecting tents, recording supplies, their impact was profound, demonstrating how structured, boring work underpins even the most legendary empires. The Keshig as guardians of empire. The Keshig's core mission to protect the Khan was always intertwined with governance. Each guard's vigilance ensured the survival of the ruler, but also allowed the Mongol administration to function smoothly. Without the reliability of the Keshig, the Khan would have been distracted by threats, unable to focus on strategy, diplomacy, or resource management. Their discipline created a zone of order in which the machinery of empire could operate efficiently. Even small actions mattered. Ensuring that horses were well fed and ready meant that the Khan could travel quickly, respond to emergencies, or oversee campaigns personally. Checking supply inventories and monitoring camp routines prevented mismanagement that could escalate into serious logistical problems. By attending to these mundane details, the Keshig enabled the empire's legendary mobility and coordination, a crucial advantage over less organized opponents. The intersection of ceremony and power. Beyond protection and logistics, the Keshig embodied authority through ceremonial presence. During court gatherings, diplomatic audiences, and internal inspections, their disciplined, uniformed presence conveyed the reach of the Khan's power. Their routines, though repetitive, reinforced social hierarchies and reminded both Mongol subjects and foreign envoys of the Khan's central authority. This dual role, practical and symbolic, illustrates an often overlooked aspect of historical governance. Power is maintained not only by dramatic acts of force, but also through the quiet reinforcement of order. By performing repetitive, boring tasks meticulously, the Keshig made the extraordinary possible. An empire spanning thousands of kilometers, held together by invisible threads of organization and discipline. Human stories behind the uniform. For those who served in the Keshig, life was a balance between prestige and monotony. Members endured long campaigns, demanding schedules and constant scrutiny. Yet they also gained trust, access to the Khan, and opportunities for advancement. Their families often benefited from their status, creating networks of influence that extended beyond the immediate scope of their duties. Every line of a Keshig ledger, every recorded rotation of a guard, tells a story. There was the young recruit learning to anticipate the Khan's needs, the seasoned officer observing a subtle shift in a camp official's behavior, the guards who maintained order while remaining invisible to the ordinary herder outside the imperial circle. Together, these human experiences reveal how the boring, repetitive routines of everyday administration sustained an extraordinary empire. Enduring lessons of the Keshig. The legacy of the Keshig endures in surprising ways. Their combination of martial readiness, disciplined observation, and administrative competence influenced subsequent empires in Central Asia, Persia, and beyond. Modern concepts of elite protective services, palace guards, and military administrative hybrids echo the principles first demonstrated by these Mongol guardians. Moreover, their story highlights a broader historical truth. Empires are as much about maintenance as conquest. While historians often celebrate battles and charismatic leaders, the daily labor of monitoring, recording, and enforcing rules, though boring, ensures longevity and effectiveness. The Mongol Empire thrived not only because of the speed of its cavalry, but because of the reliability of its systems and the invisible work of those who sustained them. Reflection on power and discipline. As we leave the world of the Keshig, consider this: the extraordinary achievements of the Mongols' rapid expansion, unprecedented coordination, and long-term governance rested on a foundation of the mundane. Feeding horses, cleaning weapons, observing schedules, recording inventories. These repetitive tasks, though dull, created resilience and stability. And so, a paradox emerges. The mightiest warriors and most feared empire in history relied not only on courage and conquest, but on the quiet, repetitive, and meticulous work of individuals who were largely invisible to the public eye. The Keshig demonstrate that history is shaped as much by diligence and discipline as by dramatic heroics. In the end, one is left with a thought-provoking question. If the survival and expansion of empires often depend on invisible, boring routines, how many other forgotten practices throughout history have quietly shaped the world we know today? Story 3: Letters in the Sand. Communication across the Mongol Empire. Imagine standing on the open steppe, the wind carrying dust and the distant sounds of hooves. Somewhere hundreds of kilometers away, a message is already on its way to a khan or a local governor, traveling across rivers, deserts, and mountains at a speed that would astonish anyone living in that era. The Mongol Empire, vast and sprawling, faced a critical challenge: how to communicate quickly and reliably across thousands of kilometers. This was not the stuff of battles and conquest, it was the monotonous, painstaking, and sometimes boring work of logistics and administration that kept the empire functioning. Yet it was this very system, often overlooked, that allowed the Mongols to maintain control over their enormous domain. The Yam, an ancient relay system. Central to Mongol communication was the Yam, a network of relay stations positioned at regular intervals across the empire. The concept was deceptively simple. Riders carried messages from station to station, switching horses at each stop to maintain speed and efficiency. These stations were equipped with fresh horses, supplies, and shelter, allowing riders to travel day and night without significant delay. The creation and maintenance of the Yam was far from trivial. Each station had to be manned, stocked, and maintained. Records were kept meticulously: how many horses were available, which riders were on duty, and which messages had passed through. This infrastructure required coordination, oversight, and repetitive administrative work. Officials documented everything to ensure that messages, often carrying life-or-death decisions, reached their destinations reliably. From the perspective of a rider, life could be both exhilarating and monotonous. Riding long stretches across empty plains, the journey demanded endurance, attention to the condition of horses, and careful navigation. Yet the work was repetitive. Mount the horse, ride, switch at a station, continue. The excitement came not from the act itself, but from the knowledge that this mundane routine held the empire together. Types of messages and their importance. Not all messages were military orders. The Yam carried reports of taxation, census updates, trade arrangements, and administrative directives. Sometimes, envoys delivered letters detailing local disputes, requests for reinforcements, or the collection of resources. The reliability of this system allowed the Mongol khans to govern remotely, issuing instructions across territories that spanned climates, cultures, and languages. Imagine a local governor in Central Asia receiving a report that a distant province has failed to deliver the expected tribute. Thanks to the yam, he could respond promptly, sending additional supplies or instructions to correct the problem. In many ways, the Mongol Empire's ability to communicate efficiently became as important as its military strength. Even minor delays could create logistical or administrative problems, highlighting how the boring work of message relay was, in fact, essential. Daily life along the yam. Life at a yam station was methodical and repetitive. Keepers were responsible for feeding horses, maintaining stables, preparing food for riders, and recording the arrival and departure of messages. Guards ensured the security of both riders and supplies, especially in remote regions prone to raids or banditry. These routines might seem tedious, yet they were critical to the reliability of the entire system. Riders themselves followed strict schedules. Fatigue was managed carefully. Horses were rotated to prevent exhaustion, and riders were expected to rest and maintain their own health to ensure that no part of the chain broke down. Records of travel times, horse health, and message delivery were meticulously maintained. This attention to detail ensured that the yam functioned not just as a communication network, but as a predictable and efficient logistical system. Challenges and adaptations. The steppe is not always forgiving. Harsh weather, difficult terrain, and distance created constant challenges for the yam. Storms could slow riders, rivers could flood relay stations, and deserts could sap both men and animals. Officials developed adaptive strategies, including emergency provisions, alternate routes, and careful scheduling to minimize delays. Cultural and linguistic diversity added another layer of complexity. Messages often traveled through regions with different customs, scripts, and administrative practices. Riders and station keepers needed to understand multiple languages, interpret documents correctly, and ensure the integrity of the information as it passed through different hands. Mistakes could have serious consequences. A misinterpreted order could lead to famine, rebellion, or military failure. The system's sophistication lay in its repetition. By following the same procedures consistently, Mongol officials could manage uncertainty and ensure reliability. This is where the boring becomes vital. Endless recording, monitoring, and standardization made rapid communication across an enormous empire possible. The human element. Behind every relay station, every horse, and every message was a human story. Riders endured isolation, fatigue, and the monotony of long distances. Station keepers balanced routine tasks with vigilance against theft or sabotage. Clerks recorded the same types of data over and over, ensuring continuity despite harsh conditions. In these repetitive actions, the Mongols discovered that consistency, discipline, and attention to mundane details could achieve remarkable results. Even minor human errors, miscounting horses, miswriting a name, delaying a message could ripple through the empire. This constant tension between monotony and consequence shaped both the people involved and the empire itself. Through the lens of the yam, we see the deep interdependence between ordinary labor and imperial ambition. Closing thought. As Section 1 draws to a close, one is left to wonder, could an empire spanning such vast distances survive without a system like the yam? How did the Mongols maintain its efficiency over decades, ensuring that messages remained accurate and timely despite natural obstacles and human error? And perhaps most intriguingly, how did the boring routines of feeding horses, changing mounts, and recording departures shape the political and military decisions of the Khans themselves? Imagine the Mongol steppe stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. Somewhere far off, a messenger is galloping toward a relay station, carrying orders that will decide the movement of thousands of soldiers, the allocation of supplies, or the timing of a military campaign. The yam, the empire's communication network, was not a static system of post stations, it was a dynamic, living infrastructure, crucial to both survival and conquest. Its success depended not only on horses and riders, but on the repetitive, detailed, and often painstaking labor of those who kept it running. The yam in military campaigns. During campaigns, the yam became a lifeline. A general coordinating multiple divisions across hundreds of kilometers relied on accurate, timely messages to execute the Khan's strategy. Even a slight delay could throw off supply lines or lead to misalignment between attacking forces. Riders moved day and night, switching horses at predetermined intervals to maintain maximum speed. A single relay could cover 100 kilometers or more in a day, depending on terrain and weather. Each station along the route functioned like a cogs in a well-oiled machine. Horses were fed, saddles repaired, messages logged, and riders rested. While the act of riding may seem exhilarating, the surrounding repetitive work cleaning stables, recording arrivals, and monitoring horse health was crucial to maintain consistency across the network. The Mongols' success in rapid campaigns often hinged on this boring precision. Commanders could receive intelligence about enemy positions, send reinforcements, or coordinate attacks across vast distances faster than opponents could respond. In essence, the mundane logistics of the yam amplified the Mongols' battlefield effectiveness. Adaptations across diverse terrains. As the empire expanded into Central Asia, Persia, and Eastern Europe, the yam had to adapt to vastly different environments. Deserts required additional water caches and hardier horses. Mountainous regions demanded alternative routes and careful monitoring of weather. Rivers and marshlands presented challenges for crossing and timing. Station keepers and riders became problem solvers. They recorded seasonal conditions, maintained contingency supplies, and adjusted schedules to ensure continuity. Local guides were often employed to navigate unfamiliar territory, while administrators maintained meticulous logs of changes to routes or station availability. Each adaptation reflected the combination of discipline and flexibility that defined Mongol governance. Even the smallest detail mattered. A missing saddle, a delayed horse, or a misrecorded stop could ripple through the network, causing delays that affected both military and civil administration. The empire's reliability rested on the daily, often tedious work of countless individuals executing these routines with consistency and care. Human stories along the yam. The yam was not just a system, it was a network of human endurance and resilience. Riders endured long stretches of isolation, battling fatigue and harsh weather while carrying messages whose importance they might never fully grasp. Station keepers repeated the same duties daily, cleaning, feeding, and preparing horses, knowing that any lapse could compromise the entire chain. Clerks copied and verified messages, sometimes under difficult conditions, ensuring that information remained accurate across thousands of kilometers. Yet, for all the monotony, there was a sense of purpose. Each participant understood that their repetitive labor enabled the empire to function. Without these human contributions, even the most brilliant military strategy would falter. In this way, the yam demonstrates the profound connection between ordinary effort and extraordinary outcomes. Communication as a tool of control. Beyond military uses, the yam reinforced the Khan's authority across the empire. Letters carried administrative orders, tax instructions, and legal decrees. Messages could be sent to governors to monitor compliance, resolve disputes, or provide guidance on resource allocation. The speed and reliability of communication allowed the Mongols to govern territories with minimal direct supervision, relying on systems rather than constant physical presence. This administrative efficiency extended the reach of imperial control, making it possible to respond to rebellions, natural disasters, or logistical challenges promptly. In essence, the yam transformed the steppe from a vast, open wilderness into a networked space where authority could be projected, decisions implemented, and information managed systematically. The limits of the system. Despite its sophistication, the yam had limits. Harsh weather could halt progress. Banditry or local unrest could disrupt stations. Human error, miswritten messages, delayed arrivals, or poorly maintained horses sometimes introduced chaos into the network. Yet the system's strength lay in its redundancy and discipline. Multiple relay stations, cross-checks, and careful record-keeping mitigated most failures, demonstrating the power of routine and repetition as tools for resilience. The system also relied on trust. Riders, station keepers, and clerks were expected to act faithfully, even in isolation. This human reliability, combined with procedural rigor, allowed the yam to function across regions the size of modern continents, a feat remarkable for the 13th century. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, one question lingers. How did the yam shape decision-making at the highest levels of the Mongol Empire? Were Khans able to strategize and govern on a scale unmatched by their contemporaries because of this boring but essential network? And more subtly, what might this tell us about the unseen labor that underpins every large organization, empire, or society then and now? By the time the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea, the yam had become far more than a simple network of relay stations. It was the circulatory system of a vast, living empire, carrying the lifeblood of information, orders, and administrative records across thousands of kilometers. The network's success relied not on dramatic battles or heroic feats, but on the repetitive, often tedious work of riders, station keepers, and clerks, a lesson in the quiet power of consistent, organized labor. The yam as a backbone of empire. Without the yam, the Mongols' ability to govern, supply armies, and respond to crises would have been severely compromised. Messages could travel hundreds of kilometers in a day, but only because every relay station functioned precisely as planned. Horses were fed, paths cleared, logs maintained, and riders rested on schedule. Each small action, repeated countless times across the steppe, became part of a system whose efficiency enabled rapid coordination unmatched in the medieval world. In military campaigns, the yam allowed generals to synchronize movements of tens of thousands of troops. A commander in Persia could receive intelligence from China and adjust strategy within days, a speed unmatched by contemporary empires. Administratively, it allowed the Khan to maintain authority over distant governors, enforce tax collection, and mediate disputes, all without being physically present. The network turned the vast steppe into a controllable, ordered space, making the Mongols' enormous empire manageable despite its scale. Human stories behind the system. The yam also reveals the human dimension of administration. Riders endured extreme distances, harsh weather, and fatigue, yet continued to deliver messages vital to the empire's function. Station keepers performed repetitive duties, tending horses, logging arrivals and departures, and maintaining equipment with diligence and care. Clerks recorded information with painstaking attention to accuracy. These tasks, though repetitive, demanded precision because the consequences of error could be catastrophic. Misrouted orders could lead to famine, rebellion, or battlefield failure. In this, we see a paradox. What seems boring on the surface, feeding a horse, recording a message, cleaning equipment, was in fact the foundation of extraordinary achievement. Each repetitive act reinforced the Mongol Empire's resilience, showing how ordinary human labor underpins even the most legendary historical accomplishments. Legacy of the yam. The influence of the yam extended beyond the Mongol era. It inspired postal systems in successor states and influenced communication networks across Eurasia. The principles of redundancy, relay, and systematic record-keeping, combined with disciplined human effort, became central to statecraft long after the Mongols themselves disappeared. The system also demonstrates a broader truth about history. Great power often depends not on spectacle but on structure. While the Mongol cavalry, sieges, and conquests capture attention, It was the quiet, repetitive maintenance of the yam that allowed those feats to be coordinated and sustained. Without these boring routines, the empire might have crumbled under its own size and complexity. Reflection on communication and control. As we leave the story of Mongol communication, consider this. Empires do not function on courage alone. They rely on the unseen, often monotonous work of maintaining order, recording data, and ensuring the flow of information. The yam exemplifies this principle. Each station, horse, and rider contributed to a system whose impact was felt across continents. In the end, one is left with a compelling thought. If the power to govern, mobilize, and conquer depends on repeated methodical labor, how many other historical achievements overlooked because they were boring shaped the course of human civilization? And perhaps more personally, what mundane but persistent efforts in our own lives might have an impact far greater than we realize? Story 4: The Art of Tax Collection, Tributes, Goods, and Livestock. Imagine the Mongol Empire not as sweeping cavalry charges across open plains, but as a vast, meticulously organized system of resource management. At the heart of this system was taxation, a mundane, often tedious process that ensured the empire's survival and expansion. While we often think of taxes today as numbers on a ledger, in 13th century Mongolia, they were far more tangible: livestock, grain, textiles, and even labor. Understanding how the Mongols collected and managed these tributes reveals the quieter, but no less essential, machinery of empire. Why taxes mattered. Taxes served multiple purposes in the Mongol world. They provided material resources for military campaigns, compensated officials, maintained infrastructure like relay stations of the yam, and reinforced loyalty to the Khan. Without reliable tribute, the empire's armies could not march, cities could not be supplied, and bureaucrats could not be paid. The act of collecting taxes was therefore far from trivial. It was a lifeline connecting the Khan to his subjects across thousands of kilometers. Yet tax collection was also inherently boring. It involved careful record-keeping, counting herds and goods, inspecting harvests, and negotiating with local leaders. These tasks may seem tedious, but they were vital to prevent shortages, avoid rebellion, and maintain order. The Mongols understood that administrative precision could be as powerful as any sword. Methods of collection. The Mongols employed a combination of direct and indirect taxation. Tribes and households were assessed based on size, wealth, and productivity. Cattle, sheep, horses, camels, and goats were counted meticulously, often during the census described in earlier stories, and allocated for tribute accordingly. Officials recorded these tallies in ledgers, sometimes using the Uyghur script adapted for Mongolian, ensuring a permanent record that could be checked and cross-checked. Beyond livestock, taxes also included goods and labor. Agricultural produce was collected from settled communities, while craftsmen and merchants might be required to provide textiles, tools, or other items. In some regions, labor contributions were mandated. Officials could call upon local populations to build infrastructure, maintain relay stations, or support armies during campaigns. Collection was not always voluntary. Local leaders were responsible for ensuring compliance, and officials sometimes needed to verify reports, mediate disputes, or enforce penalties. Yet the Mongols generally preferred a system based on accurate reporting and organized oversight, rather than brute force, another reflection of the quiet sophistication underlying seemingly mundane administrative work. Daily life of tax officials. For the Mongol tax collector, life was structured around routine observation and meticulous record-keeping. Officials traveled from settlement to settlement, inspecting livestock, verifying harvests, and recording quantities. Each detail mattered. Miscounting animals could lead to disputes, misallocation, or resentment. Record-keeping was repetitive and exacting. Officials maintained ledgers, annotated with notes about each household, clan, or village. They documented variations such as a household with a large herd but few workers, or a community with abundant crops but limited storage. These details, boring as they might seem, allowed higher officials and the Khan to make informed decisions about resource distribution, military conscription, and economic planning. Despite the monotony, there were human stories embedded in these routines. Officials sometimes negotiated with households over ambiguous assessments, mediated local conflicts, and observed the daily rhythms of nomadic or agrarian life. Each interaction, recorded carefully, contributed to a broader understanding of Mongol society and the empire's operational realities. Challenges in collection. Tax collection was far from straightforward. Nomadic mobility, seasonal migrations, and distant settlements created logistical challenges. Officials had to synchronize collection with census data, monitor livestock movement, and anticipate environmental fluctuations such as droughts or harsh winters. Even minor miscalculations could disrupt the supply chain, feeding the empire's armies and administration. Additionally, local politics could complicate collection. Tribal leaders sometimes attempted to underreport wealth, while households might hide or move livestock to avoid tribute. Officials relied on observation, cross-referencing, and occasionally negotiation to ensure compliance. These repetitive administrative tasks, though tedious, were critical to maintaining the system's integrity. The subtle power of boring work. While tax collection might appear dull, it provided the Mongol Empire with a strategic advantage. By systematically recording and managing resources, the Khan could mobilize troops, allocate supplies efficiently, and respond to crises across vast distances. The act of counting, recording, and verifying, though painstaking, created a form of control that was invisible yet absolute. Moreover, taxes reinforced loyalty and hierarchy. Regular tribute reminded subject populations of the Khan's authority, while officials' presence created accountability and order. In this sense, the boring routines of tax collection were both administrative and psychological tools of governance. Closing thought. As Section 1 draws to a close, one question emerges. How did the Mongols adapt this system as their empire expanded into regions with cities, agriculture, and complex economies? Could the same methods that worked on the steppe scale to urban environments, or did the bureaucracy itself need to evolve? And what lessons does this offer about the importance of seemingly mundane administrative work in sustaining vast human organizations? By the time the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, tax collection had become far more than a steppe-based tally of livestock. The empire encompassed sedentary cities, agricultural regions, and trade hubs, each with its own economy, culture, and bureaucratic expectations. To manage this complexity, the Mongols adapted their system, transforming tribute into a powerful tool of both governance and military efficiency. Adapting to urban economies. In the steppe, taxes were primarily paid in livestock or labor. But in cities like Karakoram, Samarkand, or Bish-Balak, the Mongols encountered dense populations, extensive trade networks, and specialized crafts. Urban populations could not be assessed using the same methods applied to nomads. Instead, taxes were levied in goods, money, and occasionally service. Artisans provided textiles or weapons, merchants contributed trade goods, and urban officials coordinated payments to central authorities. The Mongols relied on local administrators who understood these systems, often retaining existing bureaucracies while supervising them through Mongol-appointed overseers. These officials maintained meticulous records lists of households, inventories of goods, and schedules for payment to ensure accurate tribute collection. While this may seem tedious, the combination of local knowledge and systematic oversight allowed the Mongols to manage complex economies far from the steppe with surprising efficiency. Tribute and military logistics. Taxes were not merely economic, they directly supported military campaigns. Livestock provided food and transport, grain ensured the sustenance of soldiers, and artisans supplied weapons and equipment. By systematically collecting and distributing these resources, the Mongols maintained armies that could move quickly and endure long campaigns. This required precise record-keeping and coordination. A miscounted herd or a delayed shipment could disrupt a campaign, slow troop movement, or force commanders to improvise. Mongol officials used census data, local reports, and relay communications to track contributions, demonstrating again how repetitive administrative work underpinned extraordinary feats of mobility and conquest. Human labor behind tribute. The process of tax collection also involved countless human stories. Nomads and villagers were often required to travel with their livestock to designated collection points. Clerks counted animals and goods, and overseers recorded every detail. While the tasks were repetitive, feeding animals, counting grain, marking inventories, they ensured fairness and accountability. Occasionally, disputes arose. Households might contest valuations, tribal leaders might attempt to underreport wealth, or local officials might misinterpret orders. Resolving these conflicts required negotiation, patience, and meticulous record-keeping. In many cases, the solution was bureaucratic rather than violent, a testament to the Mongols' preference for systematic administration over arbitrary coercion. The subtle power of record-keeping. Tribute records served multiple functions. They tracked economic resources, informed military planning, and created accountability among officials. By maintaining detailed ledgers of contributions, the Mongols could monitor both prosperity and potential unrest. Records revealed which regions were compliant, which were struggling, and which might resist authority. This data-driven approach was revolutionary. It transformed tax collection from a simple extraction of wealth into a tool for strategic governance. What may seem boring, counting, recording, verifying, enabled the Mongols to exercise authority over diverse populations spanning thousands of kilometers. Challenges and adaptations. The Mongols faced constant challenges. Seasonal migrations, harsh climates, and diverse economic systems made uniform collection difficult. Officials adapted by scheduling collections according to local calendars, employing regional clerks, and establishing verification procedures. In some regions, barter replaced currency. In others, surplus production had to be stored or redistributed. Even mundane details required attention. Keeping accurate inventories of livestock, tracking crop yields, or monitoring artisans' output demanded patience, consistency, and precision. Each small task contributed to the stability of the empire and the effectiveness of its military, underscoring the importance of disciplined, repetitive labor. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, the question arises: how did the Mongols balance uniform imperial control with the practical realities of local economies and customs? Could a single administrative system maintain fairness, efficiency, and authority across such varied regions? Or did local adaptation ultimately determine success? And perhaps most intriguingly, what does this reveal about the quiet, repetitive work that sustains even the largest organizations, ancient or modern? By the height of the Mongol Empire, tax collection had evolved from a simple count of yurts and livestock into a sophisticated administrative system that extended across steppe, city, and desert alike. While the act of gathering tribute, counting animals, inspecting crops, recording goods may seem monotonous, it was central to the survival and expansion of one of history's largest empires. This final section examines how Mongol taxation shaped governance, military efficiency, and societal order, and what lessons it offers about the quiet labor underpinning great civilizations. Tribute as governance. Taxes were far more than economic tools. They were instruments of governance. By requiring regular, systematic tribute, the Mongols reinforced loyalty and hierarchy. Every household, tribe, and city became a node in a network of accountability. Local officials were responsible for ensuring compliance, while Mongol overseers verified records, creating a system of checks that maintained authority across vast distances. This bureaucratic approach transformed the empire from a collection of conquered territories into a functioning, interconnected society. It allowed Genghis Khan and his successors to delegate authority without losing control, ensuring that decisions from military campaigns to infrastructure projects could be executed efficiently even in remote regions. The repetitive, boring work of record-keeping and verification created the invisible scaffolding upon which the empire rested. Supporting military campaigns. The Mongol armies relied on taxes in a very practical sense. Livestock provided food and mobility, crops fed soldiers and animals, and artisans supplied weapons, tools, and equipment. Accurate records allowed commanders to plan campaigns with unprecedented precision, ensuring that troops were provisioned across vast distances. This integration of taxation and logistics demonstrates the subtle power of mundane administrative work. A single clerical error or missing tally could disrupt supply lines, delay troop movements, or even endanger lives. By maintaining disciplined routines, Mongol administrators converted repetitive counting and recording into a strategic advantage. Human stories behind tribute. Every tally recorded, every livestock count, and every inspection reflects human effort. Nomadic herders traveled to collection points, clerks painstakingly recorded quantities, and officials ensured accuracy through repetitive verification. While dull on the surface, these acts required skill, endurance, and attention to detail. Moreover, the system fostered social networks and opportunities. Officials and clerks gained prestige and influence, while households that complied faithfully could earn favor with the Khan. Even in mundane tasks, recording a goat, inspecting a field, or calculating contributions, people's lives were shaped, and the empire's stability reinforced. Challenges and adaptations. The Mongols faced challenges in balancing uniform control with local realities. Steppe nomads, city dwellers, and agricultural communities each had different economic practices, seasonal cycles, and social structures. Officials adapted by tailoring collection schedules, employing local expertise, and verifying reports through cross-checks. The system was both disciplined and flexible, a combination that allowed the Mongols to govern a diverse and sprawling empire effectively. Even small details mattered. Accurate inventories prevented overtaxation or shortages. Clear records allowed the Khan to anticipate needs and respond to crises. This demonstrates that seemingly boring work checking ledgers, counting livestock, recording grain was in fact a linchpin of imperial power. Legacy of Mongol taxation. The Mongol approach to taxation influenced successor states and even modern administrative practices. Their focus on accurate records, systematic verification, and integration with military and civil needs became a model for later empires across Eurasia. More broadly, their system reveals a timeless truth. Great achievements often rely on repetitive, meticulous labor. While battles, diplomacy, and conquest capture our imagination, the day-to-day work of counting, recording, and verifying forms the invisible foundation that enables societies to function and endure. Reflection on history and labor. As we close the story of Mongol tribute, consider this. The survival and expansion of the Mongol Empire was not just the product of cavalry, strategy, or leadership. It depended on the steady, repetitive, and disciplined work of countless individuals performing tasks that might seem boring to us. Feeding livestock, recording taxes, verifying contributions. These acts, repeated thousands of times, sustained an empire. One is left with a thought-provoking question. How many other boring, routines often invisible to history have quietly shaped the course of civilizations? And in our own lives, what small, consistent efforts might produce outcomes far greater than we expect? Story 5: The Mongol Postal Relay. How messages moved faster than riders. Imagine the vast Mongol steppe stretching endlessly beneath a wide sky. Herds graze, yurts dot the horizon, and life moves with the seasons. Survival here demanded not just skill in riding and hunting, but also careful attention to health both of people and animals. The Mongols may be famed for their military prowess, but behind the conquests lay an equally important concern: how to maintain human and animal health in a harsh, unforgiving environment. This story explores the mundane, yet vital practices of Mongol medicine and daily care, revealing how ordinary routines shaped extraordinary endurance. The health challenges of steppe life. Steppe life was physically demanding. Daily survival required long hours on horseback, exposure to extreme temperatures, and reliance on livestock for food, transportation, and trade. Injuries from falls, animal bites, or accidents were common. Infectious diseases spread quickly in camps or densely populated areas during campaigns. Malnutrition, fatigue, and exposure to harsh weather added further risk. For the Mongols, these were not abstract concerns, they were existential. Soldiers, herders, and officials could only function effectively if their health and the health of their animals were maintained. Unlike sedentary societies, the Mongols had limited access to urban hospitals or pharmacies. Survival depended on practical remedies, preventative care, and daily routines honed over generations. Traditional medicine and remedies. Mongol medicine combined empirical observation, herbal remedies, and shamanic practices. Shamans and healers played a dual role: spiritual guidance and practical treatment. Many remedies were surprisingly effective, derived from local herbs, animal products, and dietary management. Wounds were cleaned with boiled water or herbal infusions, and broken bones were immobilized using splints made from wood or leather. Dietary practices were also central to health. Mongols consumed a diet high in protein and fat, milk, meat, and fermented dairy products which provided energy for long rides and harsh winters. Fermented mare's milk, known as arag, served as both nutrition and a mild antiseptic for minor digestive issues. These routines, though mundane, milking animals, preparing fermented drinks, cooking simple meals, directly influenced survival and resilience. Care for animals and humans. Human health on the steppe was inseparable from animal health. Horses, camels, and livestock were essential for transport, food, and trade. Ill or injured animals could halt migrations, campaigns, or trade caravans. Mongols developed veterinary practices alongside human medicine, treating wounds, lameness, and parasites with a combination of herbal poultices, massage, and rest. Daily routines were critical. Soldiers and herders checked their animals' hooves, monitored grazing, and rotated herds to prevent overwork. Similarly, humans followed strict schedules for rest, hydration, and hygiene. Even seemingly minor practices, brushing a horse, boiling water for drinking, or resting after long rides, were essential for survival in a landscape where exhaustion could quickly become fatal. Medical knowledge in military campaigns. The Mongol military incorporated basic medical knowledge into campaigns. Each unit had designated healers or experienced warriors who could treat injuries and prevent infection. Tents were arranged to allow recovery, and supplies of medicinal herbs and food were maintained at key locations. Preventive care was often emphasized over cure. Rest periods, proper clothing, and careful attention to diet reduced illness, while sanitation practices disposing of waste away from water sources limited outbreaks. This attention to mundane details, repeated day after day, was essential to sustaining armies that moved thousands of kilometers and fought relentlessly. The subtle power of routine. What emerges from Mongol medical practices is the extraordinary impact of ordinary, repetitive routines. Feeding livestock, boiling water, preparing poultices, inspecting wounds. These actions may seem trivial, but collectively they enabled survival, mobility, and conquest. Health on the steppe was less about advanced technology than about consistency, observation, and care in daily life. Closing thought. As Section 1 closes, one question emerges: How did Mongol healers balance practical medicine with spiritual and shamanic practices during campaigns? Could the combination of mundane routines and ritual observation have contributed to the empire's resilience in ways that modern historians have only begun to understand? The Mongol steppe is an unforgiving environment, but the empire's armies moved with remarkable speed and endurance. Behind every cavalry charge, every long march, and every extended campaign lay a network of mundane, yet crucial practices to maintain human and animal health. The Mongols understood that even minor lapses in care could jeopardize not only individual lives but entire operations. This section explores how medicine, hygiene, and daily routines allowed the empire to function across thousands of kilometers. Field medicine and triage. Campaigns inevitably brought injuries and illness. Horses fell, riders were wounded, and digestive or respiratory problems spread among troops. Mongols relied on a combination of basic first aid and preventive care. Field healers used herbal poultices, boiled water, and natural antiseptics to clean wounds. Splints and bandages were fashioned from wood, leather, and cloth. Interestingly, Mongols practiced an early form of triage. Injuries were categorized by severity, with those most likely to recover treated first to maximize the fighting capacity of the unit. Soldiers were trained to care for each other's minor injuries, turning repetitive, mundane tasks cleaning wounds, applying poultices, feeding the sick into essential acts of collective survival. Preventive practices in campaign life. Prevention was considered more important than cure. Hygiene practices, though basic, were enforced rigorously, boiling drinking water, managing waste away from camps, and ensuring that food was prepared safely. Soldiers were expected to rest appropriately, rotate duties to avoid exhaustion, and maintain personal cleanliness despite the dusty, chaotic environment. Animals were treated with equal diligence. Horses, the lifeblood of Mongol mobility, were inspected daily. Hooves were cleaned, injuries treated promptly, and rotation schedules prevented overwork. Even the feeding of animals was carefully managed. Overgrazing could weaken herds, while insufficient food could compromise campaigns. These repetitive routines, repeated across thousands of riders and horses, formed the backbone of Mongol endurance. Herbal remedies and shamanic practices. Mongol medicine combined empirical observation with spiritual practices. Herbal remedies addressed digestive problems, fevers, wounds, and fatigue. Some herbs were applied as poultices, others brewed into teas, and many were carried in small pouches by soldiers. The use of fermented dairy, particularly mare's milk, provided hydration, nutrition, and mild antiseptic properties. Shamanic practices were woven into daily care. Rituals were believed to strengthen immunity, ward off disease, and provide psychological comfort. While modern observers might dismiss these as superstition, they had practical effects. Shamanic routines often enforced regular inspection, disciplined treatment of illness, and consistent attention to diet and hygiene. What seems like ritualized repetition had real-world health benefits. Medical logistics and supply. Even mundane administrative work played a role in medicine. Supplies of herbs, bandages, food, and water had to be recorded, transported, and rationed. Cavalry units carried limited reserves, while larger stockpiles were maintained at relay stations or depots. Maintaining accurate records of medical supplies ensured that healers could function effectively, highlighting once again the importance of repetitive, detailed work. Medical logistics also included knowledge transfer. Healers trained soldiers in basic care, ensuring that minor injuries could be treated promptly even in the absence of specialists. Written or oral instructions standardized practices across the army, making routine care consistent and predictable, an early example of institutional knowledge management. The human dimension. The experience of soldiers and healers illustrates how ordinary, repetitive practices underpinned extraordinary outcomes. Daily routines checking wounds, Cleaning water, feeding animals, preparing poultices may seem boring, yet they directly contributed to survival, morale, and operational effectiveness. Campaigns were sustained not by heroism alone, but by consistent, meticulous attention to detail in daily life. Even minor acts had cascading effects. A well-cared-for horse enabled faster mobility, a healed wound prevented infection, a rested soldier remained alert. Across the empire, these small, repetitive actions multiplied into strategic advantage. The Mongols' success depended on this invisible labor as much as on cavalry or weaponry. Closing thought. As Section 2 closes, one question remains. How did Mongol medical routines influence outcomes in extreme conditions, such as harsh winters, long desert marches, or sieges? Could the careful repetition of mundane practices have been as decisive as battlefield strategy in sustaining the empire's conquests? By the height of the Mongol Empire, the survival of people and animals was a calculated and disciplined process. While the empire is often remembered for sweeping conquests and formidable cavalry, much of its success relied on the quiet, repetitive, and meticulous routines that preserved life in an unforgiving environment. Mongol medicine, both practical and ritualistic, was as much about consistent daily practice as it was about herbs, poultices, or spiritual intervention. The legacy of preventive care. Mongol medicine was remarkable for its emphasis on prevention. Daily routines feeding horses, boiling water, rotating duties, and inspecting wounds reduced illness and injury across thousands of soldiers and animals. These seemingly mundane practices allowed the Mongols to endure long campaigns, survive harsh climates, and maintain mobility that astonished their contemporaries. Preventive care extended to nutrition as well. Fermented dairy, preserved meat, and high-energy foods ensured that soldiers and herds remained strong. While modern observers may focus on cavalry skill or battlefield tactics, the Mongols understood that consistent attention to small details, feeding, cleaning, resting, was critical to sustaining operational effectiveness. Integration of human and animal health. The Mongols' deep understanding of the interdependence between human and animal health was a key factor in their success. Horses, camels, and livestock were indispensable for transportation, food, and military logistics. Sick or injured animals could halt a campaign or disrupt supply lines. By maintaining daily routines for animal care, checking hooves, treating wounds, rotating work, Mongols ensured that their mobility and endurance remained uncompromised. Similarly, human health depended on structured routines, hygiene, rest, and medical attention. Field healers, clerks, and even ordinary soldiers contributed to this system, reinforcing the idea that survival was a collective, repetitive effort rather than a series of dramatic interventions. The role of ritual and observation. Shamanic practices, often dismissed as superstition, played an important role in reinforcing routine. Rituals provided structure, promoted hygiene, and encouraged systematic observation of illness and injury. By embedding repetitive care into daily spiritual practices, the Mongols created a resilient culture of health that extended across campaigns, settlements, and herds. This integration of ritual, observation, and practical medicine demonstrates a subtle yet profound insight. Repetition, discipline, and consistency, what some might call boring, can produce extraordinary results when applied systematically. Lessons for empire and history. Mongol medicine and health practices illustrate a broader truth about the operation of empires. Behind every conquest, every victory, and every expansion lies a foundation of mundane, repetitive labor. Feeding animals, boiling water, preparing poultices, recording supplies, these acts, repeated thousands of times, sustained life and power. Without this labor, armies would falter, campaigns would stall, and empires would crumble. History often glorifies the dramatic and visible, yet the Mongols demonstrate that quiet, disciplined routines can be just as decisive as sword and strategy. Reflection and closing thought. As we leave the world of Mongol medicine, consider this. The empire's ability to endure long campaigns, survive extreme climates, and project power over vast distances depended as much on daily, repetitive care as on battlefield brilliance. The invisible labor of healers, clerks, and horse caretakers enabled extraordinary feats of endurance and conquest. And so, one is left with a thought-provoking question. In every great achievement, historical or personal, how much of the outcome depends on the repetitive, invisible work that goes unnoticed? How many victories are quietly won not on the battlefield, but in the ordinary routines that sustain life, health, and organization? Story 6: Local governors and their secret reports. Imagine a message traveling across thousands of kilometers of steppe, desert, and mountains, moving faster than anyone could imagine in the 13th century. These were not simple letters. They were lifelines, containing military orders, tax information, or intelligence that could decide the fate of armies and provinces. The Mongols developed a sophisticated postal system, often called the yam, which relied on a network of relay stations, horses, and disciplined riders. This story explores how this system functioned, the meticulous routines that kept it reliable, and the boring work that enabled extraordinary communication. The structure of the yam. The yam was a network of relay stations positioned at regular intervals across the empire. These stations provided fresh horses, food, shelter, and rest for riders. A messenger could cover astonishing distances by switching mounts at each station, ensuring speed without exhausting the animals. Yet the system's brilliance lay not only in speed but in reliability. Each station kept detailed records: the arrival and departure of riders, the condition of horses, and the contents of messages. Clerks documented everything, often using the Uyghur script adapted for Mongolian administration. This meticulous record-keeping ensured that even if a message passed through dozens of stations, it would arrive intact. Riders, too, followed strict routines. They prepared horses carefully, rested at scheduled intervals, and followed prescribed routes. Even the seemingly mundane tasks, checking saddles, feeding animals, noting the weather, were essential to maintaining the integrity of the message chain. Types of messages. The yam carried a variety of communications. Military dispatches informed generals about troop movements and enemy positions. Tax reports allowed governors to manage resources. Diplomatic correspondence communicated instructions between the Khan and foreign rulers. Even mundane administrative reports, herd counts, harvest estimates, or local disputes traveled through this system. The reliability of these messages depended on discipline and repetition. Riders were trained to follow established routines, clerks maintained accurate records, and station keepers ensured that horses and supplies were ready. Every small, boring task contributed to the overall efficiency of the system. Daily life along the postal network. Life at a relay station was repetitive but vital. Horses were fed and rested, supplies organized, and incoming and outgoing messages logged. Guards maintained security, preventing theft or tampering. Clerks recorded every detail, ensuring that the chain of communication remained unbroken. For riders, days were filled with long stretches of riding, switching horses, and maintaining careful notes. They endured weather extremes, isolation, and fatigue. Yet the knowledge that each message was crucial to the functioning of the empire imbued their repetitive routines with purpose. Challenges and adaptations. The steppe and surrounding regions presented challenges: rivers to cross, mountains to navigate, deserts to traverse. Weather, banditry, and local political tensions threatened the reliability of messages. To counter these risks, the Mongols employed redundancies: multiple relay routes, backup riders, and emergency provisions. Human error was another potential obstacle. Clerks and riders needed to follow procedures exactly, because mistakes could disrupt military campaigns or lead to administrative confusion. The solution was standardization. Predictable routines, detailed logs, and continuous supervision minimized mistakes. In this way, repetition and discipline ensured the smooth operation of a vast communication network. The human element. The success of the YAM relied on countless individuals performing mundane, repetitive tasks with consistency and care. Riders, clerks, and station keepers were all part of a chain in which every link mattered. Their labor was largely invisible to history, yet it enabled rapid communication across the largest contiguous land empire in history. Even minor actions, feeding a horse on time, recording a message accurately, maintaining a clear route, had outsized consequences. The reliability of the Mongol postal system demonstrates how ordinary, repetitive work can have extraordinary historical impact. Closing thought. As Section 1 concludes, one question arises. How did the Mongols maintain message integrity over such vast distances and through such diverse territories? Could the combination of meticulous record-keeping, disciplined routines, and redundancy explain why messages rarely failed, even under extreme conditions? And what does this reveal about the often overlooked labor that sustains empires and civilizations alike? Imagine the Mongol army on campaign, tens of thousands of riders, wagons, and animals moving across the vast steppe. Communication in this context was not optional, it was a matter of life and death. Orders, intelligence, and logistical instructions had to reach commanders, generals, and regional administrators quickly and accurately. The Mongol YAM, or postal system, was the engine that made this possible, turning repetitive routines into a lifeline that spanned continents. Riders as the backbone. Riders formed the core of the YAM. Each was trained in endurance, navigation, and discipline. The journey was arduous, long hours in the saddle, changing horses at scheduled intervals, navigating terrain that ranged from deserts to mountains. Riders were expected to maintain precise logs, noting distances, horse condition, and the content of the message. Though the act of riding may seem adventurous, much of a rider's day involved repetition, checking tack, feeding and watering horses, and resting in between stretches. Yet this monotony was the system's strength. Consistency allowed messages to travel thousands of kilometers without error, and redundancy, multiple riders along parallel routes, ensured delivery even if one leg of the journey failed. Maintaining accuracy in the field. The Mongols faced challenges in keeping messages intact during campaigns. Horses could falter, riders could fall ill, and stations could be damaged or abandoned. To maintain accuracy, the system relied on three principles: repetition, verification, and redundancy. Repetition. Standardized routines for riding, relaying messages, and recording ensured that everyone involved knew exactly what to do. Verification. Clerks and station keepers cross-checked incoming messages, verifying counts, names, and orders before allowing the next relay. Redundancy. Critical messages were often sent via multiple routes or copied to backup riders to prevent loss. Through these mechanisms, even in chaotic battlefield conditions, orders reached their destinations intact. The Mongol emphasis on procedure and repetitive diligence turned the boring tasks of logging and checking into strategic advantages. Stations as strategic nodes. Relay stations were more than resting points, they were hubs of coordination. Each station had provisions, fresh horses, and personnel ready to support incoming riders. Maintaining these stations required constant labor. Stables cleaned, horses fed, inventories updated, and records maintained. During campaigns, these stations became lifelines. A commander's orders could travel hundreds of kilometers in a single day, keeping units synchronized across vast distances. Without the predictable, repetitive work of station keepers, even the fastest riders could not guarantee the integrity of the messages. Human stories along the routes. The yam depended on countless individuals whose work was largely invisible. Riders faced physical exhaustion, yet their training and routines allowed them to maintain speed and accuracy. Clerks performed repetitive verification tasks, ensuring that no error passed unnoticed. Station keepers, often isolated in remote areas, maintained supplies and records, performing monotonous tasks that were essential to the survival of the system. The human dimension highlights a key principle. Empire is built not only on strategy and conquest, but on the careful, repeated work of individuals executing predictable routines with precision. The system's strategic advantage. The Mongols' communication system provided a decisive advantage over other states. Armies could be coordinated over distances that would have paralyzed other medieval empires. Governors could report on local conditions, allowing the Khan to anticipate issues and respond proactively. Even minor administrative orders reached their destinations reliably, reinforcing control and preventing mismanagement. This illustrates a broader lesson. What seems mundane, feeding horses, recording logs, verifying messages, can become extraordinary when executed at scale. The repetition and discipline embedded in the yam allowed a sprawling empire to function efficiently despite its size and diversity. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, a question emerges. Could the success of Mongol campaigns be attributed as much to the meticulous routines of riders, clerks, and station keepers as to battlefield tactics? And more broadly, how often does history overlook the quiet, repetitive labor that sustains great achievements? By the time the Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent, the yam, or postal system, had become more than a network of relay stations, and riders, it was the circulatory system of imperial control. Orders, intelligence, and administrative reports traversed thousands of kilometers daily, ensuring that a Khan in Karakoram could exercise authority over distant provinces, armies, and even foreign envoys. What made this system extraordinary was not heroism or innovation in the dramatic sense, but the quiet, repetitive work of countless individuals who performed seemingly mundane tasks with precision. Reliability through routine. The yam's success lay in consistency. Riders followed strict schedules, station keepers maintained supplies, and clerks meticulously verified each message. This repetitive discipline ensured that even in extreme conditions, desert heat, mountain passes, storms, the flow of information remained uninterrupted. Messages that could determine the fate of armies or the enforcement of taxation reached their destinations intact. The brilliance of the system was in its predictability. By standardizing routines, Mongols reduced human error, mitigated risks, and ensured redundancy. The boring tasks of feeding horses, cleaning stables, logging arrivals, and verifying reports became the invisible foundation of imperial power. Human effort behind imperial communication. The yam highlights the human dimension behind empire building. Riders endured fatigue, isolation, and harsh climates, yet their disciplined execution of repetitive routines kept the empire functioning. Clerks recorded and verified messages with painstaking attention to detail. Station keepers performed continuous maintenance, often in remote or inhospitable locations. Each small, repetitive act, checking a horse's condition, noting the time of arrival, ensuring the correct transfer of a message, had outsized consequences. The Mongols demonstrate that the efficiency of an empire depends as much on invisible, mundane labor as on strategy or battlefield prowess. Strategic and administrative implications. The yam provided both military and administrative advantages. Armies were coordinated across continents, supply lines were managed efficiently, and governors remained accountable to central authority. Even during crises, the postal system allowed rapid responses. Reinforcements could be dispatched, rebellions monitored, and resources allocated with unprecedented speed. This level of administrative sophistication was revolutionary for the 13th century. It allowed a nomadic people, often perceived as chaotic or decentralized, to govern one of the largest contiguous empires in history with remarkable precision. Enduring legacy. The principles behind the Mongol postal system influenced future communication networks, both in Asia and Europe. Relay stations, standardized procedures, and redundant routes became models for later empires. The yam exemplifies how disciplined, repetitive work, often overlooked by history, can sustain extraordinary achievements over vast distances and generations. Reflection. As we close the story of the Mongol postal system, consider this. The empire's military victories, rapid expansion, and administrative control were enabled as much by repetitive, meticulous labor as by cavalry charges or conquest. The boring work of riders, clerks, and station keepers transformed the steppe into a networked empire, capable of unprecedented coordination. It leaves one with a final thought. How many great accomplishments in history and perhaps in our own lives depend on the unseen, repetitive work that we rarely notice, yet without which nothing could endure. The Mongols remind us that extraordinary outcomes often arise from the ordinary, repeated with care, discipline, and consistency. Story 7. The role of women in bureaucracy, from household management to ledger keeping. Imagine the Mongol Empire as more than just armies on horseback. Stretching across Eurasia, it was also a network of trade routes, connecting cities, deserts, and mountains in ways that transformed commerce, communication, and daily life. At the heart of this economic system were the caravans' slow-moving, repetitive, and painstakingly organized networks of people, animals, and goods. While the grand imagery of the Silk Road evokes exotic goods and bustling markets, the real story of trade under the Mongols lies in the meticulous, often boring routines that made long-distance commerce possible. The importance of trade. Trade under the Mongols was not optional, it was central to the empire's stability and growth. Merchants moved textiles, spices, metals, and grains across thousands of kilometers. Cities relied on regular supply lines for food, construction materials, and luxuries. Even armies depended on these networks to sustain long campaigns. Without reliable commerce, distant territories risked famine, rebellion, and economic collapse. The Mongols recognized that commerce could be both profitable and strategic. By controlling trade routes, providing protection, and regulating taxation, they incentivized movement while maintaining oversight. But the key to success was not in grand gestures. It was in repetitive, mundane, and disciplined management of caravans, routes, and stations. Caravan organization. A typical caravan consisted of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of merchants, animals, and support staff. Each member had specific duties. Animal handlers, guards, clerks, and cooks worked together to keep the journey on schedule. Daily routines were essential: feeding and watering animals, maintaining wagons and packs, counting goods, and checking inventory. These actions, repeated day after day, ensured that caravans reached their destinations intact. Animals were central. Camels, horses, and oxen carried goods across deserts, rivers, and mountains. Maintaining their health required careful planning, rotations, feeding schedules, rest periods, and veterinary attention. Any lapse could slow travel, damage cargo, or lead to the loss of precious commodities. Route planning and logistics. Trade routes were mapped and monitored. Stationary posts, much like the yam stations used for communication, provided supplies, shelter, and security. Merchants and caravan leaders followed established paths, adjusting schedules for seasonal changes, river levels, and regional conflicts. The Mongols invested in infrastructure. Bridges, roads, and way stations reduced travel time and improved safety. Clerks recorded inventories, monitored the movement of goods, and ensured taxes or tolls were collected systematically. These repetitive bureaucratic tasks may seem dull, but they created the predictability that allowed long-distance trade to flourish across diverse terrains. Security and protection. Banditry and political instability posed constant threats. The Mongols offered protection along trade routes, assigning armed escorts, garrison posts, and patrols. While soldiers and guards carried out these duties, much of their work was repetitive: daily patrols, verifying lists of travelers, checking cargo, and maintaining communication with nearby posts. Again, the mundane work underpinned extraordinary outcomes. By enforcing security systematically, the Mongols reduced losses and encouraged merchants from as far as China, Persia, and Europe to travel their routes. Trade became predictable, safe, and profitable, an outcome achieved through repetition, diligence, and attention to small details. Human stories along the routes. Merchants, guards, clerks, and animal handlers all participated in the slow, repetitive rhythm of caravan life. Daily tasks: feeding animals, repairing wagons, counting goods, preparing meals might seem tedious, yet they were essential to survival. Travelers faced extreme heat, snow, sandstorms, and illness, but adherence to routine made the journey feasible. Clerks meticulously recorded inventories, verified taxes, and ensured that goods reached their destinations. Guards patrolled continuously, observing predictable threats and preventing theft. Each person's repetitive work contributed to a larger, interconnected system that allowed commerce to thrive across one of the largest empires in history. Closing thought. As Section 1 concludes, one question arises: how did the Mongols balance the discipline of routine with the unpredictability of long-distance trade? Could the combination of meticulous planning, repetitive work, and systematic oversight explain why caravans thrived across deserts, mountains, and political boundaries? And what might this tell us about the invisible labor that sustains commerce and civilization across centuries? The Mongol Empire was not merely a collection of conquered territories. It was an intricate network of trade, relying on the disciplined movement of goods, animals, and people across thousands of kilometers. While the image of exotic silk and spices often dominates our imagination, the real story lies in the repetitive, painstaking routines that ensured these caravans functioned reliably. The Mongols understood that commerce and military might were intertwined. Without supplies, armies could not march, cities could not thrive, and taxes could not be collected efficiently. Organization of large-scale trade. Caravans were organized with military-like precision. A single caravan could include merchants, animal handlers, guards, cooks, and clerks. Each person had clearly defined tasks, repeated daily: feed and water animals, repair wagons, inventory goods, cook meals, patrol for threats, and maintain records. Even minor lapses could have cascading effects. A sick camel could delay travel, a misplaced ledger could create disputes over taxation, and an unguarded route could lead to theft. The Mongols imposed structure across diverse terrains. They designated way stations at regular intervals, similar to postal relay stations, which provided food, water, shelter, and veterinary care. These stations enabled predictable schedules, ensuring that caravans could reach cities and trading hubs on time. Clerks maintained detailed records of arrivals and departures, tracking goods and verifying taxes, a repetitive, time-consuming process that was vital for long-term stability. Integration with military and administrative systems. Caravans were not just economic enterprises. They were intertwined with military logistics. Armies relied on trade networks for supplies of food, weapons, and transport animals. Accurate records of caravan inventories allowed commanders to plan campaigns without risking shortages. Even the seemingly mundane task of counting grain or livestock had strategic significance. Administrative oversight extended beyond logistics. Taxes and tolls collected from merchants were carefully documented. Governors and central authorities used these reports to monitor economic activity, redistribute resources, and maintain control over distant regions. The discipline and repetition embedded in this system made it both predictable and resilient. Challenges on the road. Despite careful planning, long-distance trade was fraught with challenges. Deserts, mountains, rivers, and unpredictable weather tested both people and animals. Bandits and local political conflicts posed threats to goods in transit. Caravans relied on constant vigilance. Guards patrolled continuously, clerks verified records repeatedly, and animal handlers attended to each camel or horse daily. Each repetitive task contributed to survival. Feeding animals, checking water sources, repairing equipment, and maintaining schedules may seem monotonous, but without them, journeys of hundreds or thousands of kilometers could fail entirely. In this sense, the boring labor of routine was a critical factor in the success of trade under the Mongols. The human dimension. The lives of merchants, guards, clerks, and animal handlers were filled with repetitive, demanding work. They faced heat, cold, sandstorms, and fatigue, yet their adherence to routine ensured survival and profit. Clerks kept careful inventories, verifying shipments to prevent disputes. Guards patrolled routes systematically, deterring thieves and protecting goods. Animal handlers maintained the health of camels and horses, ensuring the mobility of the caravan. Every mundane task, repeated day after day, built a system of reliability that allowed commerce to function over vast distances. Without this disciplined labor, the empire's economy, communication, and military mobility would have faltered. Economic and cultural impact. The efficiency of Mongol caravan logistics had profound consequences. Trade networks enabled the flow of goods, ideas, and culture across Eurasia. Cities flourished, artisans prospered, and merchants gained predictable access to markets. The careful integration of routine and oversight created trust and stability, attracting traders from China, Persia, and even Europe. This demonstrates a broader principle. What seems monotonous, the feeding of animals, the counting of goods, the patrolling of routes, can underpin extraordinary outcomes. Repetition, discipline, and attention to detail allowed the Mongols to maintain one of the most reliable long-distance trade networks in history. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, one question arises. How did these repetitive routines interact with the unpredictability of long-distance trade? Could the consistent labor of clerks, guards, and animal handlers be the hidden key that allowed commerce to thrive across deserts, mountains, and political boundaries? And what does this reveal about the quiet, repeated work that sustains empires and civilizations over centuries? By the peak of the Mongol Empire, trade networks had become a defining feature of imperial power. The empire was not just a military machine. It was a vast economic system, connecting cities, deserts, and mountains across Eurasia. While stories of silk, spices, and luxury goods capture the imagination, the true engine of this commerce was repetitive, meticulous labor, the daily routines of merchants, clerks, guards, and animal handlers, who ensured the smooth movement of goods across thousands of kilometers. Trade as a strategic tool. Trade under the Mongols served multiple purposes. It enriched the empire, sustained cities and armies, and reinforced political control. By regulating and protecting commerce, the Mongols ensured that economic activity was predictable and reliable. This allowed them to plan military campaigns, supply armies, and maintain loyalty among subject populations. The predictability of trade relied on mundane routines: feeding animals, repairing wagons, verifying inventories, maintaining stations, and patrolling routes. While these tasks may seem tedious, they created a system that functioned with remarkable precision across deserts, mountains, and vast plains. Human effort behind trade. The success of the trade networks depended on the people executing repetitive tasks daily. Merchants loaded and unloaded goods, clerks meticulously recorded inventories and taxes, guards patrolled the routes, and animal handlers maintained the health of camels and horses. Each individual's labor was largely invisible, yet the cumulative effect allowed commerce to flourish over extraordinary distances. Even minor errors could have dramatic consequences. A miscounted shipment could spark disputes, a sick camel could delay delivery, or an unguarded section could invite banditry. The Mongols mitigated these risks through disciplined routines, redundancy in logistics, and strict oversight. The boring work of repetition became the hidden foundation of imperial commerce. Integration with the wider empire. The trade networks were not isolated. They intersected with other systems, including taxation, communication, and military logistics. Caravan routes linked directly to postal stations, ensuring that merchants, officials, and armies could all rely on a predictable infrastructure. By integrating these systems, the Mongols created a network that supported both the economy and governance, turning mundane administrative and logistical tasks into strategic tools. Cultural and global impact. Mongol trade networks accelerated the flow of goods, ideas, and technologies across Eurasia. Chinese silks, Persian carpets, and European metalwork traveled along the same routes, while knowledge of astronomy, medicine, and craftsmanship spread between distant cultures. Cities along the Silk Road flourished as hubs of commerce and cultural exchange, all underpinned by the repetitive, disciplined labor of the caravan system. This demonstrates a key lesson. The extraordinary often arises from the ordinary. By executing repetitive tasks with care and precision, the Mongols maintained networks that influenced economies, cultures, and politics across continents for generations. Reflection and closing thought. As we close the story of Mongol trade and caravan logistics, consider this. The empire's ability to sustain commerce, project power, and connect distant regions relied not only on conquest but on repetitive, mundane labor. Feeding animals, counting goods, patrolling routes, and maintaining records. These acts, repeated countless times, enabled commerce and culture to flow uninterrupted across thousands of kilometers. The Mongols remind us that history often overlooks the quiet, repetitive work that sustains extraordinary achievements. How many of our own successes, whether in commerce, governance, or daily life, depend on invisible routines repeated with care, discipline, and patience? Perhaps it is in these repetitive acts that the true power of civilization is hidden. Story 8: Merchant licenses and trade permits, keeping the economy in check. When most people think of the Mongols, images of mounted warriors sweeping across the steppe come to mind. Yet the empire's survival and expansion relied as much on diplomacy as on cavalry charges. Envoys, negotiators, and administrators performed repetitive, painstaking tasks that allowed the Mongols to forge alliances, manage conquered peoples, and communicate with foreign powers. The power of diplomacy lay not in dramatic speeches or battles, but in routine, disciplined procedures carried out day after day. The role of envoys. Envoys were the lifeblood of Mongol diplomacy. They traveled long distances to deliver messages, negotiate treaties, or gather intelligence. Every envoy was trained in the rules and etiquette of communication, ensuring that messages were delivered accurately and interpreted correctly. Their journey was filled with repetition, preparing documents, verifying instructions, checking supplies, and maintaining detailed records of contacts and outcomes. Envoys were often armed with letters sealed by the Khan, sometimes accompanied by gifts or tribute. These items were carefully catalogued and protected. The mundane work of inventorying, safeguarding, and transporting materials ensured that the diplomatic mission maintained credibility and authority. Establishing alliances. Mongol diplomacy relied on meticulous record-keeping and procedural consistency. Alliances with local rulers, tribal leaders, and foreign powers were not based solely on negotiation skills. They required repeated verification of loyalty, tribute payments, and military obligations. Clerks documented agreements, ensuring that commitments were enforceable and traceable. These routines reinforced the Mongols' reputation for reliability and order. Leaders could trust that promises made through formal channels were respected, and that records could be used to resolve disputes. Diplomacy, in this sense, depended on the repetition of small, boring administrative acts rather than dramatic displays of power. Communication across distances. Distance posed a constant challenge. Envoys traveled across deserts, mountains, and steppe, often relying on the same relay system used for postal messages. They maintained logs of routes, rest stops, and contacts, repeating the process to ensure accuracy. Even minor errors in transcription or timing could lead to miscommunication, misunderstandings, or conflict. Repetition and standardization were essential. Envoys followed predictable protocols for greeting, presenting gifts, and delivering messages. Documents were carefully copied and sealed. These repetitive, precise routines ensured that Mongol diplomacy remained effective, even in regions far from the Khan's presence. Managing conquered peoples. Diplomacy was not only external, it was also internal. The Mongols governed diverse populations by negotiating with local leaders, establishing tribute systems, and integrating existing bureaucracies. Envoys and administrators carried out repetitive inspections, verifying compliance with agreements, recording tax payments, and resolving disputes. Such work may seem mundane, but it was critical for maintaining stability. By embedding diplomacy in routine procedures, the Mongols reduced the risk of rebellion, ensured the flow of resources, and created a predictable political environment across their vast empire. The human element. Envoys and administrators often endured fatigue, isolation, and the monotony of repeated tasks. Daily routines included copying letters, verifying records, inspecting settlements, and observing the behavior of local leaders. While the work lacked glamour, it was essential. Each routine action reinforced authority, ensured compliance, and maintained the flow of information necessary for imperial cohesion. The Mongols demonstrate a key historical principle. The effectiveness of diplomacy often rests on repetition, accuracy, and disciplined attention to small details, rather than on dramatic confrontations or negotiations alone. Closing thought. As Section 1 concludes, one question emerges. How did repetitive routines, record-keeping, and procedural consistency allow Mongol diplomacy to succeed across such vast distances and diverse cultures? Could the disciplined, boring work of envoys and clerks have been as decisive in shaping the empire as military campaigns? While the Mongol army could conquer vast territories with unmatched speed and force, their ability to govern and maintain control often depended more on diplomacy than on the sword. Envoys, negotiators, and administrators worked tirelessly behind the scenes, performing repetitive, methodical tasks that ensured treaties were respected, allies remained loyal, and adversaries were managed strategically. This section examines the operational side of Mongol diplomacy during campaigns, revealing how routine, careful work shaped the fate of empires. Diplomatic procedures on campaign. During campaigns, the Mongols relied on a combination of formal negotiation and strict procedural adherence. Envoys traveled alongside armies, carrying messages, negotiating surrender terms, or coordinating alliances. Each envoy followed standardized protocols. Documents were checked and rechecked. Gifts were cataloged and delivered according to custom, and records of discussions were meticulously maintained. The repetition of these routines was crucial. A single misdelivered letter or improperly presented gift could lead to mistrust or rebellion. By maintaining predictable procedures, the Mongols minimized misunderstandings, even when interacting with rulers whose customs were unfamiliar. Securing alliances and subjugation. The Mongols used diplomacy to complement conquest. Some rulers were persuaded to submit voluntarily, offering tribute and military support in exchange for protection or autonomy. Others required more formal arrangements, oaths of loyalty, hostages, or documented agreements. Clerks and envoys repeatedly verified these agreements. Tributes were counted and recorded, hostages registered, and local leaders monitored for compliance. While this work was painstaking and monotonous, it ensured that alliances were reliable, that obligations were enforceable, and that the Mongols maintained authority without expending unnecessary force. Managing diverse cultures. The empire encompassed a staggering diversity of peoples: Muslims, Buddhists, Christians, nomads, and sedentary urban populations. Diplomatic routines helped bridge these cultural differences. Envoys learned local customs, languages, and ceremonial practices, applying repetitive procedures to present messages and gifts in culturally appropriate ways. This attention to detail reinforced trust. Even minor errors failing to observe a local greeting or presenting a gift incorrectly could cause offense. Repetition, training, and careful documentation minimized these risks, allowing the Mongols to operate effectively across vastly different societies. The role of record-keeping. Record-keeping was central to diplomatic success. Envoys maintained logs of interactions, agreements, and promises. Clerks at regional centers verified these records against tribute payments and military obligations. Repetition in documentation created a chain of accountability that stretched across continents, making agreements enforceable and disputes resolvable. This bureaucratic labor, while monotonous, gave the Mongols an edge over rivals. Whereas other states relied on memory, trust, or force alone, the Mongols backed diplomacy with evidence, ensuring consistency even in the most distant provinces. Routine as strategic advantage. The repetitive nature of Mongol diplomatic work, copying letters, recording tributes, verifying hostages, was not accidental. By enforcing consistency, the Mongols minimized human error, strengthened reliability, and created predictability. This predictability allowed local rulers to understand the consequences of compliance or rebellion, while the Khan could coordinate alliances and military campaigns with confidence. In essence, diplomacy operated like a well-oiled machine. The boring, daily work of clerks and envoys powered the grand outcomes of conquest and governance. Without this foundation, military victories could have been ephemeral and alliances fragile. Human stories behind diplomacy. The envoys, clerks, and negotiators endured fatigue, isolation, and repetition. Days were filled with copying letters, verifying records, cataloging tributes, and observing local behavior. These mundane tasks, performed with care and discipline, were essential for empire-wide stability. Their work highlights a key historical principle. Diplomacy's power often lies in the invisible, repetitive acts that create trust, accountability, and predictability. The Mongols' ability to govern an empire stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian was built not only on the sword, but on the meticulous, boring work of these individuals. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, one question arises. How did the Mongols' reliance on repetition, verification, and routine allow diplomacy to succeed where force alone might have failed? Could it be that the boring, administrative labor of envoys and clerks was as decisive in shaping the empire as military conquest itself? By the height of the Mongol Empire, diplomacy had become an essential instrument of power, as vital as cavalry, archery, or siege engines. Envoys, negotiators, and clerks were the hidden workforce ensuring that treaties were honored, allies remained loyal, and conquered peoples were integrated into the empire. What allowed this system to succeed across thousands of kilometers of diverse terrain was not brilliance in isolated moments, but the disciplined repetition of mundane tasks, the invisible labor of empire building. Reliability through routine. The success of Mongol diplomacy rested on meticulous routines. Envoys followed standardized procedures for delivering messages, presenting gifts and recording agreements. Clerks maintained detailed logs, verifying tributes, hostages, and military obligations. Repetition ensured accuracy and predictability, allowing distant rulers to understand the consequences of compliance or defiance. Even during campaigns, when speed and adaptability were critical, these routines provided stability. Envoys could negotiate under pressure because they operated within established protocols. Clerks could cross-check records, preventing disputes or errors. This consistency transformed boring, bureaucratic labor into a strategic advantage. Integration with military and administrative systems. Mongol diplomacy was deeply interconnected with other imperial systems. The same relay stations used for the postal network supported envoys, while trade routes enabled the movement of tribute and gifts. Military campaigns were coordinated with diplomatic negotiations, and local governance relied on repeated inspections and record-keeping. This integration amplified the effectiveness of routine labor. By standardizing and repeating procedures across different functions, diplomacy, trade, communication, and military administration, the Mongols created an empire capable of functioning efficiently over unprecedented distances. Human stories behind diplomacy. Envoys and clerks often endured long journeys, extreme climates, and monotonous work. They copied letters, cataloged tributes, monitored hostages, and observed local customs. Each act, repeated countless times, ensured that agreements were honored, misunderstandings avoided, and alliances maintained. Their efforts underscore a critical historical principle. The stability and success of empires often depend on invisible, repetitive work that supports grander achievements. Without these individuals performing boring routines, conquest alone would have been insufficient to maintain control over such vast territories. Enduring lessons. Mongol diplomacy demonstrates that administrative consistency, repetition, and attention to detail can be as powerful as military force. By creating predictable systems for communication, negotiation, and oversight, the Mongols were able to govern a culturally diverse and geographically expansive empire. The broader lesson applies beyond history. Sustained, disciplined effort in small, seemingly mundane tasks can enable outcomes far greater than any single dramatic act. In diplomacy, governance, and daily life, the quiet labor of repetition often forms the invisible foundation of lasting success. Reflection and closing thought. As we leave the world of Mongol diplomacy, consider this. The empire's ability to negotiate alliances, integrate conquered peoples, and manage distant territories relied on the invisible, repetitive labor of envoys and clerks. Military conquest alone was insufficient. Stability emerged from careful, disciplined routines performed day after day. One is left with a thought-provoking question. How often do we overlook the small, repetitive acts in history or in our own lives that quietly sustain great achievements? And what might we accomplish if we applied the same consistency and care to our own boring but essential routines? Story 9: Surveying the Land. Mapping pastures, rivers, and villages. The Mongol Empire is often remembered for its vast conquests, sweeping across Eurasia at unprecedented speed. Yet behind every victory, every army, and every caravan, there was life inside the yurt, the traditional felt tent that housed Mongol families. While conquests grabbed the spotlight, the everyday routines of domestic life were equally essential for survival. These routines, often repetitive and mundane, shaped the resilience, endurance, and cohesion of Mongol society. The structure of the yurt. A yurt, or jur, was a portable circular tent made of wooden lattice walls covered with felt and canvas. Its design was simple yet effective, easy to dismantle and transport, resilient to wind and snow, and insulating against the harsh steppe climate. Inside, space was carefully divided. The central hearth provided heat and a place for cooking. Beds, storage chests, and shelves for household items were arranged along the perimeter. Life inside a yurt was defined by repetition and order. Each member of the family had specific responsibilities: preparing meals, maintaining the fire, cleaning, tending animals, and repairing the structure. These mundane tasks were performed daily, yet they were crucial for survival, comfort, and social harmony. Daily domestic routines. Morning routines often began before sunrise. Water had to be fetched from nearby streams or wells, animals fed and milked, and breakfast prepared. Meals consisted largely of dairy products, meat, and grains, often fermented or preserved to last through long winters. Cooking was repetitive. Boiling milk, preparing dried meat, or making kumis, fermented mare's milk, required careful attention and consistent practice. Cleaning and maintenance were equally important. Yurts were swept, felt coverings inspected for damage, and repairs made promptly. These actions, repeated regularly, ensured that the home remained livable through harsh winds, snow, and rain. The role of family and community. Mongol domestic life relied on cooperation. Children assisted with chores from a young age, learning the skills necessary for survival. Adults divided labor according to ability and experience. Older members provided guidance, ensuring that routines were followed precisely. Even social interactions were structured and repetitive. Meals, storytelling, and communal gatherings followed predictable patterns, reinforcing bonds within the family and community. These routines, though monotonous, created stability in an otherwise unpredictable environment. Health and hygiene. Health inside the yurt depended on daily habits. Smoke from the central hearth helped deter pests, while routine cleaning reduced the spread of disease. Water was boiled before use, and dairy products were fermented to prevent spoilage. Personal hygiene was maintained through repeated washing and grooming, critical in a society where disease could spread quickly in dense encampments. Animals, too, were central to domestic life. Horses, sheep, goats, and camels provided milk, meat, and transportation. Feeding, milking, and tending to their health required constant attention. The repetitive labor of animal care was integral to the family's sustenance and economic stability. Seasonal routines. Life in a yurt was also governed by the seasons. Spring and summer demanded travel to pastures, requiring repeated packing, moving, and unpacking of yurts. Winter required preparation, preserving food, insulating homes, and ensuring animals had shelter and forage. These seasonal routines, repeated year after year, created resilience and continuity in an environment that could otherwise be harsh and unforgiving. The invisible labor of survival. Much of domestic life may seem mundane: sweeping floors, boiling milk, mending felt, feeding animals. Yet these repetitive tasks ensured survival, comfort, and social cohesion. The ability of Mongol families to maintain these routines allowed armies to function, caravans to move, and communities to endure. Survival depended on this invisible labor, repeated day after day with precision and care. Closing thought. As Section 1 concludes, one question emerges. How did the repetition of domestic routines within the yurt shape not only survival, but also the social structure and resilience of Mongol society? Could the stability created by these mundane tasks have been as crucial to the empire's endurance as its military conquests? Life inside a Mongol yurt might appear simple from the outside, but surviving on the steppe demanded constant vigilance, repetitive routines, and adaptability. Every day brought small, incremental challenges: harsh weather, limited resources, and the ever-present needs of family and livestock. The Mongols mastered the art of repetition, creating a rhythm of domestic labor that ensured both survival and the continuity of their nomadic lifestyle. Weather and shelter maintenance. The steppe climate was unforgiving. Winters were bitterly cold, with snow and wind threatening both humans and animals. Summers brought intense heat and occasional storms. Maintaining the yurt required constant attention, Felt coverings had to be inspected for holes, the wooden lattice reinforced, and the hearth cleaned and fueled to provide consistent warmth. These tasks were repeated daily and seasonally. Firewood had to be chopped, stored, and rotated. Smoke holes in the yurt's roof were adjusted to balance ventilation and heat. Even small mistakes, leaving a patch unrepaired or neglecting to clean soot from the hearth, could jeopardize comfort, health, or survival. Food preparation and preservation. Nutrition depended on routine. Families processed milk from horses, cows, or goats, often fermenting it into kumis or cheese. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked for storage. Grains and other staples were cleaned and stored meticulously. Preparing meals was a repetitive process, boiling, churning, mixing, and portioning each day. Food preservation required careful observation. Temperature, moisture, and storage conditions were checked repeatedly. One spoiled batch could mean hunger or illness for the family. Through these monotonous tasks, Mongols ensured a stable food supply, critical for both daily life and survival during long migrations. Animal husbandry as a daily ritual. Animals were at the heart of domestic life. Horses provided transportation and milk. Sheep, goats, and camels supplied wool, meat, and dairy. Daily routines involved feeding, watering, milking, grooming, and inspecting animals for disease or injury. The health of the herd determined the family's prosperity. Regular care, repeated methodically, prevented illness and ensured productivity. Failure to adhere to routines could slow travel, reduce milk yields, or even threaten survival during winter months. Here, repetition became a life-saving strategy rather than a mere habit. Hygiene and health maintenance. Maintaining health in a small, portable home required vigilance. Daily cleaning, smoke management, and personal hygiene were repeated with care. Water was boiled, utensils washed, and bedding aired. Even simple routines, washing hands before handling food, inspecting children for parasites, or cleaning milk containers had significant impacts on well-being. These habits were mundane but critical. Consistency in hygiene and sanitation reduced the spread of disease and ensured that families remained strong enough to endure the physical demands of nomadic life. Seasonal migrations. Every year, families followed predictable migration patterns to reach pastures for their livestock. Moving a yurt involved repetition, disassembling the structure, packing goods, transporting animals, and setting up at a new site. Every family member had assigned tasks, repeated in sequence, ensuring efficiency and minimizing risk. These migrations were exercises in discipline and routine. Even small errors, forgetting a tool, misplacing provisions, or neglecting animal care could delay the move or reduce survival odds. Here again, repetition and meticulous labor were survival strategies, quietly sustaining life across vast and challenging landscapes. Social and cultural repetition. Domestic routines also reinforced social cohesion and cultural identity. Meals, storytelling, religious rituals, and seasonal celebrations were performed regularly, embedding social norms and values into everyday life. Children learned skills and responsibilities through repetition, ensuring that knowledge and survival strategies passed from generation to generation. Even seemingly mundane tasks, sweeping floors, mending clothing, or preparing dairy products, taught discipline, cooperation, and endurance. These practices shaped not only individual survival, but the cohesion and resilience of Mongol society as a whole. The invisible labor of survival. Much of Mongol domestic life might appear monotonous, yet the repetitive tasks performed inside the yurt were essential for survival. Feeding animals, preparing food, maintaining the home, and practicing hygiene were all forms of invisible labor that ensured the family could endure both environmental and social challenges. This invisible work underscores a broader historical principle. Stability and survival often rely on repetition, discipline, and care in the everyday. boring activities that we rarely notice. The Mongols' mastery of routine allowed their families, and by extension, their armies and empire to endure extremes that might have overwhelmed less organized societies. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, one question arises. How much of the Mongol Empire's resilience depended on the disciplined, repetitive routines of domestic life? Could the seemingly mundane labor inside the yurt have been as crucial to survival as military prowess in sustaining one of history's largest empires? By the height of the Mongol Empire, the yurt had become more than a simple dwelling. It was a hub of survival, education, and social cohesion. Life inside these felt walls depended on repetition, discipline, and careful attention to detail. While the Mongol conquests often dominate history books, it was the invisible, repetitive labor inside the yurt that underpinned the empire's endurance, resilience, and adaptability. Routine as a strategy for survival. Every day in the yurt followed predictable patterns: tending animals, preparing meals, maintaining hygiene, and repairing the structure. These routines, repeated across generations, ensured that families could survive harsh winters, scorching summers, and long migrations. Small actions, boiling milk, sweeping floors, inspecting animals, accumulated into a system of resilience. This repetitive labor allowed Mongol families to remain mobile, self-sufficient, and capable of supporting armies and caravans. Without these routines, the nomadic lifestyle that enabled rapid conquest would have been unsustainable. The mundane, often boring work of daily survival became a strategic advantage. Education and skill transmission. The repetition of domestic tasks also functioned as education. Children learned essential survival skills by observing and participating in daily routines: milking, cooking, animal care, and tent maintenance. These skills were embedded in cultural practices, storytelling, and seasonal migrations, ensuring that knowledge persisted across generations. This continuous transfer of expertise maintained the social and economic fabric of Mongol society. It was a subtle form of preparation for the demands of life on the steppe, where failure to adhere to routine could have dire consequences. Resilience and social cohesion. Routine fostered social cohesion as well. Families and communities relied on the predictable execution of duties. Cooperation in domestic tasks reinforced relationships and built trust, ensuring that everyone contributed to collective survival. Festivals, storytelling, and seasonal ceremonies, repeated annually, reinforced shared identity and cultural continuity. These social routines provided stability in an environment defined by unpredictability. The repetition of small acts, from feeding livestock to preparing communal meals, created a network of interdependence that allowed Mongol society to endure extreme conditions. The invisible backbone of empire. While armies conquered territories and envoys negotiated alliances, it was the disciplined routines of domestic life that sustained the human capital behind these achievements. Soldiers depended on families for food, supplies, and care for animals. Merchants relied on households for trade goods and labor. Administrators and clerks benefited indirectly from the stability provided by well-managed communities. In this sense, the yurt and the repetitive, meticulous labor it housed was a foundation for the Mongol Empire itself. Without the invisible work of daily survival, conquest and administration would have been far less effective, and the empire far less durable. Reflection and closing thought. As we leave the world inside a Mongol yurt, consider this. The empire's endurance was not solely a product of military skill or leadership. It was sustained by daily routines repeated meticulously over generations, by tasks that may seem mundane but were essential for survival. Feeding animals, maintaining the home, and preparing food, these small, repetitive acts allowed families, armies, and the empire itself to thrive. One is left with a final question. How often do we overlook the invisible labor in history, or in our own lives that quietly sustains extraordinary achievements. Perhaps it is in these ordinary routines, repeated with care and discipline, that the true resilience of civilizations and of people is found. Story 10: The Census Bureau's Secret: How Names Were Recorded. While the Mongols are often remembered for their military conquests and vast empire, religion and spirituality played a subtle but persistent role in their daily lives. Life on the steppe was harsh and unpredictable, and spiritual practices provided structure, meaning, and guidance. Yet these practices were not always dramatic rituals. They often consisted of repetitive, disciplined routines that shaped moral codes, social cohesion, and decision-making across the empire. Shamanism, the heart of steppe spirituality. Before the Mongols adopted or encountered organized religions from their conquered territories, shamanism formed the core of their spiritual life. Shamans, or burer, acted as intermediaries between the human and spiritual worlds, guiding communities through illness, natural events, and personal dilemmas. Daily spiritual routines were repetitive. Offerings of milk, fermented mare's milk, or small portions of food were placed on altars or near sacred sites. Ritual chants and prayers were performed regularly, often at the same times each day. These repetitive acts were not just superstition, they reinforced cultural identity, ensured social cohesion, and maintained a sense of order in an unpredictable environment. Seasonal and life cycle rituals. Mongol spirituality was closely linked to the rhythms of life. Seasonal migrations, births, marriages, and funerals were marked by ceremonies repeated year after year, following established patterns. Births, infants were often blessed, and repetitive protective rituals ensured health and fortune. Marriages, formalized exchanges of gifts and blessings, followed customary sequences, reinforcing social ties and alliances. Deaths, funerals involved ritualized handling of the body, repeated prayers, and offerings intended to secure the deceased's journey in the afterlife. Repetition in these rituals provided continuity, teaching new generations the cultural and spiritual norms of the community. Religion as guidance for daily life. Religious practices were not confined to ceremonies. Shamans and later Buddhist monks or Islamic scholars advised families and leaders on daily decisions, from choosing auspicious travel times to interpreting omens. These small, repeated acts, prayers before a journey, offerings at key sites, consultations with spiritual guides structured everyday life. For example, before setting out on a migration or military campaign, repeated spiritual routines, prayers, offerings, and ritual blessings were observed. These acts, while seemingly mundane, were believed to ensure the favor of spirits or deities and to protect the community against misfortune. Interactions with conquered religions. As the Mongol Empire expanded, its people encountered Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism. Rather than imposing a single faith, the Mongols incorporated aspects of these religions, often using repetitive devotional routines to integrate new practices. Monks, priests, and religious scholars maintained temples and shrines, performed daily prayers, and taught communities the rituals necessary to sustain faith. Even the seemingly simple act of lighting candles, arranging offerings, or reciting prayers repeatedly contributed to the social and spiritual stability of newly incorporated populations. These mundane actions created a sense of predictability and cultural continuity, easing transitions under Mongol rule. The human element. The spiritual life of the Mongols relied on countless individuals performing repetitive, disciplined actions. Shamans maintained sacred spaces, Buddhist monks chanted sutras daily, and ordinary families performed rituals to protect health, property, and fortune. These acts may seem monotonous, but they provided structure, guidance, and meaning. Repeated devotion reinforced social bonds and cultural identity, allowing communities to endure the uncertainties of life on the steppe and within a vast, multi-ethnic empire. Closing thought. As Section 1 concludes, one question emerges. How did the repetition of religious and spiritual routines help the Mongols navigate the unpredictable steppe and the complexities of empire? Could these boring, daily rituals have been as vital to social cohesion and survival as their military campaigns? As the Mongol Empire expanded across Eurasia, it encountered a stunning diversity of religious traditions. Buddhism in Tibet, Islam in Persia, Christianity in Eastern Europe, Taoism in China, and local shamanistic practices across the steppe. While conquest is often associated with force, the Mongols relied heavily on repetition, ritual, and administrative routines to manage these interactions. Their spiritual approach emphasized practical accommodation, with repeated ceremonial observances providing stability and legitimacy to their rule. Integration and tolerance. The Mongols were pragmatic in religious matters. They recognized that imposing a single faith across the empire could provoke rebellion or instability. Instead, they permitted conquered peoples to continue their rituals, while Mongol officials ensured that these practices followed established routines. Temples, mosques, and monasteries were maintained systematically, often under the supervision of clerks who recorded donations, land ownership, and ritual schedules. For example, in Persia, Islamic scholars continued to manage religious courts, collect zakat charitable tax, and perform daily prayers according to prescribed times. The Mongols ensured these routines were observed and recorded, reinforcing both religious and civic order. Similarly, in China, Taoist and Buddhist institutions continued their rituals, supported by Mongol oversight that required repeated maintenance and offerings. Ceremonial practices across the empire. Ceremonies were a crucial tool for legitimizing Mongol authority. Public rituals, repeated annually or seasonally, reinforced the presence of the Khan and his representatives. Festivals, sacrifices, and processions often combined spiritual observance with political messaging. Annual offerings. Mongol leaders and communities performed regular offerings to spirits or deities, ensuring the favor of supernatural forces. State ceremonies. In newly conquered territories, the Khan's envoys observed local rituals and sometimes participated, repeating these practices to demonstrate respect and maintain harmony. Military blessings. Before campaigns, soldiers and commanders observed repeated rituals to seek protection, aligning spiritual discipline with practical objectives. These repeated ceremonies helped normalize Mongol authority, creating a predictable rhythm in otherwise turbulent regions. Even the most mundane aspects of ritual arranging offerings, reciting prayers, or observing precise timings contributed to the empire's cohesion. Shamanic continuity and political authority. Shamanism remained a foundation for Mongol leadership. The Khan and his inner circle relied on shamans to perform divination, interpret omens, and provide guidance for decision-making. These practices were highly repetitive. Daily consultations, ritual offerings, and scheduled ceremonies formed a consistent framework for governance. By maintaining these routines, the Mongols reinforced their spiritual legitimacy. Leaders' decisions, whether regarding warfare, taxation, or alliances, were framed as aligned with divine or supernatural will. Repetition in ritual practices ensured continuity and predictability, both for Mongol elites and for the populations they ruled. The human dimension of spiritual life. Across the empire, ordinary people, farmers, herders, and merchants performed repetitive spiritual practices daily. Simple acts like lighting candles, reciting prayers, or offering small portions of food to spirits created structure and reassurance. Families and communities reinforced these routines through shared practice, storytelling, and teaching children the correct sequence of ritual acts. The accumulation of these small, repeated actions stabilized social life. In harsh environments, where survival often depended on predictability, spiritual routines provided psychological and cultural grounding. While armies fought and envoys traveled, these repeated domestic and communal rituals ensured the empire endured in everyday life. Religious diplomacy and empire building. Religious routines also served diplomatic purposes. Envoys observing local rituals demonstrated respect, reducing tension and fostering cooperation. Repeated ceremonial observances, documented and monitored by clerks, allowed Mongol officials to mediate disputes between religious communities, collect taxes, and maintain civic order. In essence, repetition in spiritual life was both practical and symbolic. It integrated diverse beliefs, stabilized conquered populations, and reinforced Mongol authority, all while embedding cultural continuity in daily practice. Closing thought. As Section 2 concludes, one question emerges. Could the Mongols' careful maintenance of religious routines and repeated ceremonies have been as important to the empire's stability as military or administrative systems? How did the invisible, repetitive work of spiritual observance quietly underpin governance across a culturally diverse empire? By the peak of the Mongol Empire, religion and spirituality had become subtle yet indispensable instruments of governance and social cohesion. While military conquest expanded borders, it was the disciplined repetition of spiritual routines, daily prayers, offerings, seasonal ceremonies, and ritual consultations that helped integrate diverse peoples, legitimize authority, and sustain social order across vast distances. The Mongols demonstrate that the extraordinary endurance of an empire often depends on the ordinary, repetitive labor of daily life. Integration through repetition. Religious and spiritual practices were not isolated. They were integrated into the empire's administrative and social systems. Clerks recorded donations, monitored temple maintenance, and ensured that rituals were conducted according to prescribed routines. Envoys and officials observed local religious practices, repeatedly participating in or overseeing ceremonies to demonstrate respect and reinforce authority. The repeated observance of rituals across cultures created predictability. Subjects, from Buddhist monks in Tibet to Muslim scholars in Persia, understood the expectations for worship, offerings, and civic participation. This predictability fostered compliance and minimized unrest, allowing the Mongols to govern culturally diverse populations effectively. Social and cultural stability. Ritual repetition reinforced social cohesion. Families and communities performed daily, weekly, and seasonal spiritual tasks, from reciting prayers to offering milk or lighting candles. Children learned these routines early, ensuring that knowledge and cultural identity were transmitted across generations. Even minor, seemingly mundane actions, cleaning ritual spaces, arranging offerings, or chanting mantras, accumulated into a reliable structure of social and cultural continuity. In unpredictable environments and politically volatile regions, these routines provided stability and reassurance, shaping not only spiritual life, but also practical governance. Legitimacy and authority. For Mongol rulers, spiritual routines were a tool of legitimacy. Shamans guided the Khan through daily rituals and divination, while public ceremonies reinforced the perception that leadership aligned with divine or supernatural will. Repetition in these practices created trust, predictability, and authority. When the Khan's decisions on warfare, taxation, or diplomacy were framed within ritual observance, subjects were more likely to accept and obey them. In this sense, boring spiritual routines were deeply political, underpinning the empire's ability to rule distant territories without relying solely on force. Cultural exchange and legacy. The Mongols' approach to religious practice facilitated cultural exchange. By respecting existing traditions and repeating rituals faithfully, they allowed Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and Taoism to flourish under imperial oversight. Temples, mosques, and monasteries became centers of learning, trade, and cultural continuity. The repetition of spiritual practices ensured that diverse communities remained engaged, productive, and loyal. Over time, these routines left a lasting impact. Religious tolerance, ceremonial integration, and respect for repetitive ritual became hallmarks of Mongol governance, influencing successor states and shaping Eurasian cultural landscapes for centuries. Reflection and closing thought. As we conclude the story of Mongol religious life, consider this. The empire's endurance was supported not only by armies and envoys, but by countless repeated acts of devotion, ritual, and spiritual observance. Feeding spirits with milk, chanting prayers, maintaining sacred spaces, these mundane routines sustained social cohesion, legitimized leadership, and stabilized diverse populations. One is left with a final question. How often do we underestimate the power of small, repetitive actions, spiritual, domestic, or administrative, in shaping history? Perhaps it is in these boring routines, quietly repeated day after day, that the resilience of civilizations and the endurance of human societies is truly forged.